And for those who enjoy this channel and would love to support us financially, please feel free to hit that donate link. We'd greatly appreciate it. God bless.
Awesome. Okay, guys, we're back. Before we get too much into this, I think our technical issues have been taken care of, but we'll just do kind of an audio check. Everybody in the audience, let us know if we sound okay, and then we can get her going. We'll just wait for some audience peeps to let us know if it's good. How you guys doing tonight?
We're good. I just listened to it. Your audio's rearing and going good.
Praise, you are rehired.
Nice.
You're the man with the plan again.
I can get another stimulus now.
I was getting worried there for a second, Praise, but Praise is also the board of directors here on Team Standing for Truth, so he's got the power to fire me, believe it or not, and I founded this channel.
Well, 5 minutes ago, Praise was standing on ice so thin, I swear he was walking on water.
That was pretty. That's a good one.
That is a good one. You know, you can't stay mad at Praise for too long, though. He's just such a good guy. So Praise, living, and you guys are good. Glad to hear. Living the dream. Another day in paradise.
Another day in paradise. Being relentless as usual. Fighting the good fight. Fighting the good fight.
That a boy.
There you go. Fighting the good fight. I like that.
So. Okay, so yeah, announcement-wise, well, actually, tonight, as we were going over before, but there's no sound, so yeah, it's going to be laid back. We're going to go through our good old buddy Godless Engineer's video that he just put out against me and the model that we put forth. So that should be fun. We'll go line by line if we have to. Yeah, it's going to be fun. Like I said, it's going to be more kind of laid back. If the audience has any questions or comments or anything, we can try and address those at a time most convenient. Announcement-wise, tomorrow it is confirmed, so we should be good to go. Me and, his YouTube channel's name is Kakarot. He debated Kent Hovind, I think, last week on Modern Day Debate. Seems like a nice guy, so we're just going to have a friendly back-and-forth dialogue on universal common ancestry versus separate ancestry. So I'll be there for that. Next week, we should have a couple other debates. We're just working at confirming them, so we'll keep everybody posted. But that being said, why don't we just kind of get right into it? Praise. Did you want to play the video? We'll go through a couple minutes.
Yeah. Let's do it. I'm going to share the screen. So y'all can hear it. That's why I love StreamYard, because you can do all this stuff. And I see Sal in the chat. Nice to see you, brother. What a awesome time to have you in here.
Shout out to Sal. He's been an incredible blessing on our channel. He's helped us with a lot, actually. He's got some good lectures out there, so please check that out. Hopefully we'll have him back on as well. He's an incredible mind. I love this because there's so many, warriors for Christ, and a lot of people fighting this good fight, a lot of very knowledgeable people. So keep it up, and thanks for the support, everybody. I mean, we've got a lot of people in the chat, so let's have some fun.
Yeah, just a message to Salvador from New Zealand. Magadang hapon, kumusta ka, kabayan. You'll know what I'm talking about.
I won't even try and guess.
All right, here we go. Let's get rolling.
What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today, I'm responding to a video where Standing for Truth apparently responds to me, although it really just ended up being him cutting up a portion of his introductory statement to one of his debates, putting it right after one of my statements, and apparently that's supposed to refute me, even though that was the exact thing that I was refuting. So, let's see what Standing for Truth has got today. Let's see if his...
Just say jump in and pause. Anything you guys want to say, just jump on in and just let me know.
Pause it there. I'll give like a 2-second. So what's funny is with Godless Engineer, we've we've got an entire play. Well, I've debated him before, so check that out too. That was a really enjoyable debate. A lot of the things he said, to be honest with you, I've refuted directly in that debate. So check that out. But yeah, as I was saying, we got an entire playlist addressing his arguments, his videos. Matt and I put out recently like almost an hour video refuting him on chromosome 2 fusion. We were incredibly detailed. We put out videos on testable predictions. I can hear myself echo there. I'm not too sure if that's coming from Praise's end or
It might be on Gavin's end, yeah.
He is muted though.
Oh, he is. Hold on, let me put myself on mute then.
So then, yeah, it might be okay. So
Gavin,
yeah,
you got Jason now.
Maybe. Yeah, it looks like we traded Gavin for Jason. Okay. And Jason's Australian and Gavin's New Zealand. So perfect. Okay, so before I lose my train of thought, yeah, that's what I was saying. So we got an entire playlist, hours and hours worth of responses to him, and he's never once responded to any of those, right? So he came out with a video recently, and instead of just wasting time on another lengthy edited video, his argument that he was putting forth, I'm like, you know, the same old arguments they bring up over and over again. And I've had so many debates recently against Erica, RJ Downer, David, for example. I mean, lots of debates you can go check out where I've refuted the very argument he was putting forth in a previous video. So I just cut out a quick clip and said, okay, here we go. Let's just address the overused argument. But since the video was only a few minutes long, I guess he thought, okay, you know, here's one that I feel like I can maybe address. Because I'll tell you one thing, the chromosome 2 fusion video we've put out, yeah, he's not going to be able to address that one. I'd love to see that. Actually, I would just debate him on chromosome 2 fusion. That's one of my favorite topics to discuss. But yeah, so he's kind of complaining about that, but that's the reason why. I mean, you guys know we got a huge playlist. Love to see him address some of the videos we've put out refuting him, but yeah, that's all I got to say on that one.
All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go in big chunks. No responding for 5 minutes, so we're going to do 4 chunks, and whatever you have to say, and then when we pause it after these 4 intervals, then yeah, you can say what you want to say after the interval's over.
For me, I've only skimmed through this. So I'll write down some notes as well, just to. Yeah, that's good. We'll go through bulk because when we finish this video, we can turn it into more of an open chat, and maybe if somebody in the live chat wants to join too. So we'll it'll probably take about 45 minutes or so to refute him here, maybe an hour actually. But after that, yeah, we'll open it up. Good idea, Brady.
Yeah, so in about 5 minutes, we're going to just respond real quickly. You have anything to say, to add, and then we'll keep on going each interval. Here we go.
His little section actually disproves whatever I was trying to say. If you guys are interested in any of Standing for Truth's dumb shit, then please stay tuned. All right, heathens. Well, first, he starts off by playing my particular section, and so we're going to take a look at that. But this entire thing is going over genetic diversity. And basically, the way that I see it is that there's an inherent contradiction with Standing for Truth's position. So let's take a look and see which particular portion he actually has a problem with, and then I'll try to explain myself. It is that 2 people, Adam and Eve, propagated the entire species of Homo sapiens before a flood wiped out most of the population, and then a population of 8 people then populated the entire world with Homo sapiens. Let's just put the whole minimum viable population of Homo sapiens on the back burner for a second. We don't really have time right now to discuss how 2 organisms don't really have enough genetic diversity in order to propagate or sustain a substantial population of individuals. Okay, so in that particular section, I was actually saying, hey, let's not concern ourselves with the violation of the minimum viable population for humans, which incidentally is just over 4,000 individuals. That would be the number of people that would need to exist in order for us to stave off harmful genetic mutations. That number of people provides enough genetic diversity in order to do that. Now, there is an inherent contradiction here with Standing for Truth's position, because he has a problem with minimum viable population for like cheetahs of 10,000 or 6,000 or whatever the population of cheetahs is now. He has a problem with that as far as genetic degradation goes, which is a made-up word that he loves to throw around a lot. Basically, he hypothesizes that the genes or the DNA of the cheetahs is degrading in some fashion, which I really don't know how he would gauge that if it's not just by harmful mutations, which they're not accumulating harmful mutations any more so than any other group out there, because they are well above the minimum viable population for cheetahs. This has been thoroughly covered with Standing for Truth. But the inherent contradiction here is that he has a problem with the minimum viable population for cheetahs and humans when we're talking about evolution, but when he talks about his magical god theory, it seems to be a no issue. The minimum viable population for any species is fine. Like, it's just something that doesn't exist. I've never really understood why that was until this video. All right. So, Standing for Truth's response here is to specifically the minimum viable population for humans and other organisms as a refutation to his idea that all life diversified from just 2 individuals or 8 individuals after the flood thing.
Creationists and evolutionists have vastly different explanations for the origin of genetic diversity. I will only briefly touch on the created genetic diversity hypothesis, and will do so by asking, would God have created Adam and Eve with 2 identical versions of DNA, and Eve the same way? If this were the way God chose to do things, Adam and Eve would have created clones. God said, be fruitful and multiply, not be fruitful and clone yourselves. What makes the most sense, both scientifically and theologically, is that God created DNA differences from the start.
No, the Adam and Eve having all of the genetic differences or the potential for genetic differences at the start, and that explains how 2 people could populate the world, does not make scientific sense. This is not a scientific theory. Scientific theories generally don't have a theological aspect to them either. They're Standing for Truth. Basically, what he's saying here is that both Adam and Eve had different DNA, which doesn't exactly make sense. I mean, God pretty much cloned Eve from Adam. Why on earth would God take Adam's rib and then fashion a new person and them have a completely separate genetic code? Eve was a copy of Adam, just without a Y chromosome. But
all right, guys, go ahead, S&T, if you want to jump on in now. That's their first interval.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So lots of things to address, even in that 5 minutes. Okay, so why don't we... and Jason's already laughing because he knows. And all quite easy to explain, actually. Even in his arguments already about viable population sizes, for example, he's already assuming his model, because, and I even said it in the clip that he just played, that evolutionists assume that all these mutations we see are the source for all variety. And they reject our model of front-loaded genetic diversity, right? These DNA differences were encoded into Adam and Eve at creation, pre-existing functional diversity. And of course, that would apply universally across species, but we're kind of focusing on humans here. So his arguments based on that, for example, the cheetahs, they are down to, like, I think it's 6,000, for example, right now. They used to be down to 10,000, and it's because of their bottleneck. I mean, they've got recessive mutations that are coming to the forefront, and that's why we always talk about their out of Africa bottleneck. which would have involved severe inbreeding and genetic damage, for example. You know,
when their bottleneck requires a lot longer time period. It's really devastating if you look into it.
Actually,
the amount of time.
Actually, that's a great point, Jason. So you know what? Because we're trying to address so many points, we'll just destroy that, because he says there's a problem with Adam and Eve. For one, he assumes that Adam and Eve, he assumes away the front-loaded diversity. He assumes away perfect genomes, because we know mutations have been accumulating since creation. Now, according to their model, here's what's important. We got to break this down so everybody can understand. Their model explains the diversity by mutations over time. That's why they need millions and millions of years. Okay, mutations have been their driving force to take their fish to fishermen, for example. So now you've got these cheetahs. Okay, you've got these cheetahs that are now, like I said, down to 6,000. There's very limited genetic diversity. Their sperms degenerate, for example. Conservationists are incredibly worried about them. We can compare that to their out of Africa scenario, which would, as Jason, you said, it would have been an extended near extinction event. It wouldn't have been one generation. It wouldn't have been two generations. It would have been thousands of generations. And some say, I debated a biologist, he said, because I think Francis Collins says that population may have been down to 2,000. Some say 10,000. Some say a little bit more. But these recessive mutations, they would have come to the forefront. But then we're supposed to believe that, thousands of years later, this highly degenerate population of 2 to 10,000 just suddenly exploded into all parts of the world, being as highly degenerated as they are. But now, evolutionists already explained the origin of DNA differences as mutation. So already it's an incredible problem for them. For us, we're proposing created genetic diversity, okay? So from our model, there's no problem, because according to the biblical base model, what do we start with? We start with two people, Adam and Eve, okay? Adam and Eve were created with pre-existing functional DNA differences, no mutations, okay? Inbreeding is a problem because it exposes the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. There is no genetic mistakes. And evolutionists can't think past their basic worldview, okay? Because they assume the DNA difference is a result of mutation. We don't. So perfect created genomes with DNA differences within and across too. Even if Eve was a clone, doesn't matter. She'd still have DNA differences within herself, and the X chromosome and the Y chromosome would have been different, of course. So that's just basic. I'm not sure why he didn't acknowledge that, but that's just basic. So yeah, no issue there. But later on in his video, he gets a little bit more into that. So we'll just cover this right here. But we start with two people, Adam and Eve. Then 10 generations later, we've got a second, for the most part, single generation bottleneck, okay, of 8 people. So creation was a bottleneck, single generation. The second bottleneck is now at the flood, 8 people, for example. Now, both bottlenecks were extremely brief, not extended like theirs. And we don't explain the origin of DNA differences, mutation. So there's at the time of the flood, there'd be very little accumulated mutations. Okay, and especially with that environment in the pre-flood world, I would imagine that mutations accumulate more and faster now, environmentally, in many different factors. But okay, so just one generation for both bottlenecks. Both were followed by rapid and exponential growth. And in both cases, there would be, as I said, almost no previously accumulated mutations, therefore no inbreeding effects. Unlike the out of Africa scenario, which, and I feel like I got to repeat this for the evolutionists just to understand it, they are the ones that explain the origin of genetic diversity as a result of mutation, combined with their extended near extinction event associated with severe inbreeding. Their out of Africa scenario is not even remotely feasible, and the cheetahs that are down to 6,000 is kind of supporting evidence for that. So just human genetic diversity in general is not a problem for us. We have low genetic diversity, okay, as a human species, which we would expect based on the biblical base model. We came from just Adam and Eve, therefore low genetic diversity is expected. The evolutionists, it wasn't expected. They were shocked. Therefore, they had to invent the out of Africa population bottleneck theory. But as we went over, and Jason touched on too, it's not even remotely feasible. That's why, and you'll see in my debates, I've debated this topic over and over again, all we get as an answer is far-fetched mental inventions and imagination, but nothing that's actually empirical. So Jason, you got any thoughts on that, brother?
Yeah, it's definitely all imagination. Yeah, no, all you get is all I've noticed is from everything that you've been saying, and he denies this, is that genetics is a code, and that there's no way to compare it, any other way to compare it. I was on his channel one day, and one guy was sitting there doing his best to explain to me why genetics is not a code, and that I'm just missing, I'm just like, I'm not understanding it properly, and that it's just this, like a simple, like it all just fell together somehow, simply, like sort of stuff. And I'm just sitting there, I'm thinking, and GE's sort of saying the same sort of thing, and I'm just sort of sitting there and thinking, what the hell are they talking about? You know what I mean? Anyway.
Yeah, no, it just comes down to the fact that they use an argument based on a straw man, because if we're trying to explain all the genetic diversity, all the DNA differences as a result of mutation over time, then of course that's going to take millions and millions of years, of course, but that's only if you assume that that's the result of mutation over time. But if we're proposing front-loaded genetic diversity, which leads to testable predictions, because their next argument would be, that's post hoc ad hoc reasoning. Oh yeah, well, we've made specific predictions on speciation rates, mutation rates, DNA function, which we can get into a little bit later. I hear a bit of an echo there. I'm not sure whose end it's coming from, but
I'm muted.
What I find funny about praise, we can hear an echo there. I'm not sure if somebody's got it in the background or. So what's funny about
it sounds funny.
Godless engineers' argument about biological information is everybody muted? I can hear a big echo. Yeah, praise coming from your end.
Can you understand what I'm saying? Because you're echoing when.
Yeah. When are you guys able to hear
it?
What's that?
It sounds funny.
Yeah, you can hear an echo, eh?
Yeah.
Everything was going smoothly. I don't know what changed.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there.
It
was working fine.
Okay, so what's funny about Godless engineers? Yeah, I can't go with hearing that echo. You're gonna have to solve that problem.
It might be. Are you talking at a phone right now, SFT?
No, just right on the laptop.
All right.
I don't hear an echo from your end. I only hear it from everybody else, but not Frank.
Try now.
What about now? You can hear an echo there, Jason?
Yeah.
Yeah, big time echo. Can the audience hear it too?
Yeah.
Is there a lag? Maybe there's some lag issues going right now.
Just guessing.
Yeah, but this is it's normal for many people though. So
it's what?
It's normal. Like when people do stream reviews, this is like normal stuff that happens.
No, there was a lot of people there, but they took off because the stream dropped, and then they would have gone somewhere else, and then they never got the notification that it was going again. So they just don't know. Otherwise, they'd probably be there. That's what I noticed. So they've just like jumped off somewhere else or gone somewhere else, whatever. It's not that's why they
there's still 22 people though.
Yeah, well, whatever. It's not a big deal. I mean, people can watch it later anyway. So, yeah.
I'm going to drop it and come back in because I won't be able to do this.
All right.
So we'll try. If not, we'll just have to call it a night. Here, I'll try it again. Just a sec.
Yeah. Well, if it's going to do that, yep. I suppose so.
Yeah, but these issues happen frequently during stream reviews.
And it's not just that; it's the echo. It sounded, it's like he's talking. It's like you can. It's like sometimes you can understand some words, but then other words are just like bip, 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 bip. It's like, what?
It looks
Ah,
like
that's the good argument
it looks
against
like the
evolution.
echo
I
is
never
better.
heard.
I think the
I
echo
never
might
heard
be.
such a good evolution.
It is better, yeah.
Okay, I'll shut up. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't hear no echo anymore. Is Gavin in the stream, brother Gavin?
Maybe
I'm
that
not
was the
sure
cause too.
because the
He
first time
doesn't.
there was an echo, he got out and it
Yeah.
fixed. So I don't know. Hopefully, but before I lose my train of thought, so as you can see here from the template, you know, Godless Engineer will say that the DNA code is like Diet Coke, right? He'll argue that biological information, for example, like in my debate, I went over genetic degeneration, and I found it hilarious because, you know, how do we measure information loss, for example? I mean, you can see paper after paper that measures levels of homozygosity, for example, or allelic diversity, or you can look at papers that compare genomes and they'll look at deletions, for example. I mean, a deletion in the genome, a mutation like that, suggests a loss of some kind. You know, and mutations that are harmful, even most of your and I like the way Sal puts it, right? A lot of these beneficials, for example, that they'll point to, they are functionally compromised or reductive in nature. You know what I mean? They've got a bit of a benefit to be had, an advantage to be had, but there is a deleterious effect associated with it as well. Sickle cell anemia, for example, is due to a broken protein. Something broken should imply to anybody with common sense that there is some type of degeneration, degradation, loss going on. You know what I mean? But it's just an evolutionist tactic to avoid the obvious effects of mutations, and especially mutation accumulation. I mean, disease is not good. A single point mutation can be destructive, can lead to disease. So these evolutionists can play games all they want, but it's because it's really their only way to avoid the clear evidence. And I like to ask the evolutionists, you know, do you really believe that man is getting better presently? And most honest evolutionists, most honest people will admit, no, you know, man is presently degenerating. And a lot of them will chalk it up to lack of natural selection in the human population, things like that. But man is clearly degenerating. And I think Godless Engineer is one of the only ones that denies that. But he'll just argue that it's all merely organic chemistry. It's not real information. But that is literally like somebody implying that an encyclopedia has no real information. It's just paper and ink. Or a computer, for example. No, a computer has no real information, guys. It's just electricity flowing through circuits. No, the fact is information regardless of the medium. And I always get asked, what's your definition of information? And I like Dr. John Sanford, I think, taught me this definition. But I think the best definition is functional specificity communicated through language or code. And he asked, like, what is degeneration, for example, in this clip, but I think I already refuted that. I mean, mutations that cause disease, broken genes, broken proteins, broken cells, deletions in a genome, shifts from levels of heterozygosity versus homozygosity, where there's less diversity available, is a loss of genetic potential, a loss of variability. So, I mean, that's really all we see is losses. And the evolutionist knows that, and someone like Godless Engineer, instead of facing the facts, he has to ask questions such as, what is information loss, or how do you measure information loss? Well, that's been answered over and over again. So on that 5 minutes, I think that's pretty well all I have to say, unless you guys have anything to add.
Yeah, some real quick. So I think Godless Engineer's kind of dense on certain scientific topics. And one of them is, he goes, genetic entropy is a made-up word that no one even thinks of. That's like, it's useless in science. And yet you have people like Lynch and some other top known evolutionist biologists using this language of entropy in the genome. But another thing is too is this careless hermeneutics. Like he just brings up like the rib. He doesn't even understand biblical hermeneutics in the first place. So why would he be criticizing he knows nothing about? And he thinks he knows stuff, but he really doesn't. I don't know if you heard of this, SFT, but did you hear the rib in the Hebrew actually means curve? It could even refer to the DNA curve for all we know. So that's just something to think about as well.
Well, even a lot of the papers that I show regarding populations in the past that went extinct, literally they went extinct due to genetic degeneration. Is he going to deny that? I mean, even the evolutionists, when I debated Erica, she said, no, genetic entropy, what you mean is error catastrophe. So even she's recognizing this, or they will refer to it as mutational meltdown. But I mean, I've got paper after paper that I often show in these debates. Mammoth populations, they were highly, highly inbred. They carried an elevated genetic load, probably contributed to their extinction. I've had a debate with Erica on human evolution, and I pointed out the fact that these so-called pre-humans were not actually pre-humans, right? Homo floresiensis, heidelbergensis, erectus, neanderthalensis, Naledi, for example, they suffered from accelerated genetic degeneration. I mean, you can see papers that are talking about this, where they were highly inbred. They suffered from reductive evolution. And what this does is it results in anomalies and pathologies such as reduced brain size, body size, brain volume, and just a number of pathologies. Like this is literally degeneration. And you're right. Yeah, I don't know if just the mindset that he has scientifically, maybe he just doesn't really understand that. But yeah, I mean, the evidence is there left and right. So human evolution's been destroyed because their best so-called pre-humans they can point to are just highly degenerated modern humans that suffered from reductive evolution, because after Babel, you got your dispersal, your migration patterns. For example, unfortunately, a few of these people groups, they migrate to an area where they're now isolated. Environmental conditions are at play there. They become inbred. Unfortunately, we're not saying this is good, but then over generations, over time, it results in a rapid and accelerated genetic degeneration, which explains all these features that they point to as primitive, right? Oh, these are primitive features, and these are pre-humans evolving into modern man. No, it's quite the opposite. It's modern man that unfortunately have I don't want to say devolved, because they are modern people groups, but unfortunately inbreeding and accelerated genetic degeneration, it's real. And as John Sanford says, genetic entropy is a scary thing. It's not fun. Genetic disease is harmful. Mutations are harmful. Nobody's happy over this, but genetic entropy does point to Jesus. It gives us a need. It shows us our need for a savior. That's all I got to say there.
All right, we're going to get this rolling here. Another 5-minute interval. Here we go.
Standing for Truth is saying that both of these individuals were created by God and had all of the genetic diversity contained within their DNA, so that when they propagated the species, and under his understanding, mutations and the DNA just sort of shrinks over time, and they lose information from their DNA, whatever the fuck they mean by information. And so basically, when Adam and Eve mated and had offspring, in order to create all the black people, they would have had to have lost information in order to do it. That's if you think of Adam and Eve as originally being white. But the way that skin color is actually determined in our genes, which we'll get to here in a minute, that would actually not happen. So basically, the diversity in humans was all contained in Adam and Eve, and through their propagation, they lost information in their subsequent generations, and that gave us the diversity of humans. The problem with this idea is that the amount of mutations that we've been able to track and know to have occurred would not have fit into the genome of Adam and Eve if they were humans. So apparently, Adam and Eve were some kind of superhuman entities that were not human people, according according to him, at least if he were to stay consistent with his idea, they would have to be some other kind of species of hominid that existed and then sort of faded away. I mean, I really don't understand, because the genetic mutations that we know to have occurred over the long period of time that humans have been here would simply not fit in the genome of a human. It's a lot like the TARDIS from Doctor Who. He thinks that Adam and Eve had TARDIS DNA. That would be that it's bigger on the inside than it seems on the out. All right, let's see how he explains his TARDIS DNA theory.
This is the idea of created heterozygosity. Adam and Eve would have had within their DNA the genetic potential to produce every shade of skin that exists on the planet or known to man.
All right, so he just mentioned the skin tone thing, and basically, from what we understand about skin tone, it's controlled by about 4 different genes. And these genes have different variants. One particular variant of the gene that's most closely related to skin color actually helped the Europeans have lighter skin color, while the lesser expression of another gene made the skin darker. But all this comes down to gene variants and mutations. There was a mutation in the genes that allowed for lighter color skin and darker color skin. So I really have no idea what he means when he says that Adam and Eve were created with all the diversity needed. What would that look like? Are all of these genes just stuffed into their DNA with no way to choose how to express it? Like, did Adam have like all the genes for, super dark skin color and super light skin color? If that were the case, then what did Adam look like?
Yeah.
Stop it there, just because before we get on, can you hear me, brother?
Yeah. Genes, the skin color, and the genes. He said there's 4 genes. There's actually 6 they've discovered. They used to think there was 4, but now they know there's 6 that control your skin color. So you got that wrong to begin with.
Right. Yeah. And you know what? Once again, he assumes that all DNA differences and invariants are the result of mutation over time. So you can see that over and over again, they just can't get it out of their head that is their basic assumption. We have our assumption. Ours actually leads to testable predictions. But when it comes to because he's so confused, right, with what he's saying, like, I just don't understand that. Well, okay, so according to our model of created heterozygosity, okay, where do all the skin colors, where do all the shades of skin come from, according to our model, the biblical-based model? Well, we can just look at basic genetics, and this actually goes back to Gregor Mendel. He actually lived at the same time as Darwin, and Darwin knew nothing about genetics, which is interesting because the arguments that he used for common ancestry, we know that genetics is the only direct way of answering the question of ancestry. It's genes and traits that are inherited, not fossils, not rocks. I mean, we go over this over and over again. So that's why we're making predictions in genetics. But yeah, so this goes back to basic Mendelian principles or genetic principles, for example. We can think of capital and lowercase letters, okay? Big A, little a, for example, big B, little b. These letters now, okay, they constitute different features and traits. For example, if you have a capital A, and this is actually answering his questions and arguments directly, if you have a capital A, let's say for dark skin, and now we have a little a for light skin. Okay, if you have a couple such as Adam and Eve.
Oh no, the dreaded echo.
Like, why does that just come out of nowhere? I don't understand. Praise, is there anything being done in that moment where the echo occurs? Like, did you press a button? Did you do it? It just came out of nowhere.
I know. Yeah, I have no idea, man. So, best thing to do is probably come back in and out. Looks like that solves it. So.
Yeah. He also said it was white. Like the Godless engineer said that we believe Adam and Eve were white. Well, we don't believe that. So got that wrong as well. Not to mention that's old science. That there's 4 genes that control the color of your skin, and now there's 6.
Yeah, his biblical scholarship's horrendous and a joke.
Yeah, and his knowledge is he knows nothing about what he's talking about. He comes on to say he debunk us, but then just doesn't even know what we're saying. So
And,
he comes on and
that's
says,
a good point, Jason. Oftentimes they will argue against a straw man. For me, when I debate, I like to show, like when I was debating R.J. Downard, I talked about the cytochrome C, the highly conserved mitochondrial DNA protein, and how the differences, according to their model, is a reflection of time. And that gene, that protein, it forms hierarchies across the biological world, right? I will explain to them their model, what they believe, and accurately, and then I will give our explanation and, you know, what we believe on that, for example, when it comes to DNA function and so on and so forth. So that's the way people should engage in debates. They should understand both positions and represent the person who they are debating. They should represent their position accurately. But evolutionists, 99.9% of them, they actually don't represent our position accurately. I can't tell you how many times in my opening I go over the fact that we explain the vast majority of DNA differences is created diversity, and I explain to it in detail. And then at the start of the discussion, I always say, hey, I don't want to talk past each other. Can you reiterate for me the difference between my model and your model regarding the origins of DNA differences, genetic diversity? And they can never reiterate it back to me, which means they're either not paying attention or they're just so confident with their own model. But yeah, so they're just constantly arguing against a straw man. Do you find the same thing, Jason?
yeah, they're always making up some idiotic straw man argument. So they don't get to know our science behind what we say. And I mean, you know, I saw something about, I saw a screenshot where some evolutionist was claiming that there was a really tall person and a really like short midget, and they were saying it was two different species, like human species. There is no speciation in the human. I mean, there's variation, ethnic variation, but there's no real speciation, because you get the same humans are 0.012% genetically identical. I mean, there's only that much difference between, say, a black person and a white person, so everybody's so close genetically.
And they have a huge problem with that, which is why they have to resort to
because they have to say that the different races evolved on different evolutionary branches.
Right.
They have to say that, because some races are more evolved than others, and so on and so forth. And that's just the way it is. That's exactly. Did we just drop? Oh no, that's exactly what they say. Without that, that hurts them. So when they discovered that, they were sort of shocked and horrified.
And that brings us to his question and his argument in the video. We should stick to that. So, for example, what were Adam and Eve according to their skin tone now? So, as we were explaining earlier, if you have capital A for dark skin and a little a for light skin, for example, if you have a couple such as Adam and Eve, let's figure out using alleles in genetic diversity and figure out what they were. Well, if they were capital A, capital B, both of them would then logically and scientifically have dark skin. All they can produce now is dark skin. You know, they're homogeneous, for example. And the same thing is true if they were all lowercase letters too. That would mean that they could only produce light-skinned people. As I've said over and over again, God said, be fruitful and multiply. It would make no sense for God to create Adam and Eve with no pre-existing genetic DNA differences. Wouldn't make any sense, because God didn't say be fruitful and clone yourselves. It makes absolutely no sense. So it is a hypothesis that works. Now, if Adam and Eve, according to our model, are created heterozygous, say they're a mix of capital and lowercase letters, capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, and I'm trying to explain this as simple as possible so when Godless Engineer watches it, he won't have these same questions that are fairly easy to answer. So with those letters, with that allelic, with that built-in diversity, they would be a middle brown skin tone. They now, as I said in the clip he showed, they now have the potential to produce literally every shade of skin that exists on the planet. But the point is, Godless Engineer, is that Adam and Eve, based on this model and based on everything that I've explained, they would have within their DNA that potential now, with your mix of capital and lowercase letters, to produce every shade of skin that exists on the planet are known to man. It's pretty basic. It also leads to predictions, which is the most important part of it. But the races, well, we know the Human Genome Project has
Well,
proven
just
that we're all
the
of
Asian.
one blood. You know, it's just different shades of skin. It's not even races. That's what the Bible predicted, and that's what the genetics has told us. Oh, go ahead, Jason. Sorry.
I was just going to say that the only difference between an Asian eye and a European eye is a layer of fat between the eye. So that it's just very simple things that may make us look very different from each other. But you can get a 3 foot tall pygmy and a 7 foot tall blonde haired blue eyed German, and they're 99.988% similar to each other. So. You know what I mean? Like, it's, when you think of it like that, it's evolution. It just kills it right there.
It does. It does kill it. And everything that we see, like, for example, now we have to look at the distribution of these genetic differences around the globe. You know, we got to look at allelic frequencies, for example. A lot of time atheists will say, well, how can you tell the difference between that which is a designed allele and that which is, say, a mutation over time? And it's like, sure, we can look at allele frequencies, those alleles that are rare, obviously due to mutation, probably after Babel, and those that are common, and we'll get more into that later, those are the ones that are created. Of course, because I think we all roughly have, Praise, Jason, myself, we all have 4 to 5 million DNA variants, SNPs, within us already. But we'll get into that more on something that he says. But so these genetic differences that already exist within Adam and Eve, they're sorted out, and these groups were isolated based on the dispersion and migration from Babel, because that's where they would have been, for example, congregated in the same place. They would have been one language with mixed features, but that spreading out from Babel now explains the particular set of genetic features that are seen around the globe. And these sets of genes are unique markers for their past lineages, for example. You can look at the Y chromosome. Y chromosome is fascinating because God dispersed the people groups based on the male lineage, the Y chromosome. And the Y chromosomes are geographically specific. For one, Y chromosome variation is very low, very limited. That's why we can look at a branching tree based on Y chromosome differences, and they go back to a single man who's not a chimpanzee, an actual human being, just thousands of years ago. Actually, based on a new study, the mutation rate in Y chromosome is faster than expected. It goes back just 4,500 years to Y chromosome Noah, and I explained that to RJ Downard in our debate and whatever. That leads to testable predictions as well. But what's fascinating is these Y chromosomes. They are geographically specific. You got Chinese Y chromosomes, African Y chromosomes. You've got European Y chromosomes, because after Babel, these groups spread out to different parts of the globe, and they started mutating and changing and having different population histories independently from one another. And we can see that in the distribution of alleles. Literally, the genetic structure and the allele frequencies and distribution around the globe speaks to us of a literal Adam and Eve. Like, we have traces of Adam and Eve all throughout our genome. It's fascinating. It's actually, you'd have to ignore 95% of the genetic data to reject a literal interpretation of Genesis.
Well said. I want to make one point real quick. I don't know if you guys seen his shirt, but he says evolution's a fact. Well, I don't know if he's being facetious with that or kidding with that, but if he's serious, he's going outside the realm of science, and it makes evolution a tautology. And I don't know of any scientist that says evolution doesn't have problems. Like, name one scientist that says evolution's 100% untarnished. Good luck. That means he's a fanatical evolutionist, and I think that shows everything about this guy. Just like with his illiteracy with the Bible too. So how about we play like 10 more minutes or something like that, and we'll keep just jump on in. Just jump on in.
Let's do it. Well, because the only other things he said was, what does he mean by information, and more on that. And in the previous section, we already demolished his idea of DNA being like Diet Coke. We've given our definition of information. We've given multiple examples of genetic entropy. So we're not going to just reiterate all that. So yeah, do another 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll start.
Yeah.
Just jump on in. Maybe we could play 3 minutes if you guys want. Just whatever you guys feel like you want to jump in, just call out.
Yeah, if
Not to
we hear
mention
something,
that, but
yeah.
all of the other different mutations that we find in humans now, what were their eye color? Because some of the same genes that control skin color also control eye pigment. Mutations have occurred that gave us, like, blue eyes. Did Adam have blue eyes? Did Adam have some kind of weird color that we can't even describe? The thing is that they cannot describe
I'm just going to say
what
10
it
seconds.
means.
That's exactly what I just covered, is the allele frequencies. Blue eyes is a mutation. It's rare, okay? It's a rare allele, and that means it's happened after Babel. It's so easy to just look at the frequencies of alleles and the distribution of them around the globe to be able to figure out what's created. What's a created and designed allele. And obviously DNA function is key. If it's functional and beneficial to the organism, obviously that should suggest that that's designed. But a really good technical paper in 2018 that I'm going to post in the description of this, I want people to look at it. It was written by Dr. Sanford, Dr. Carter, Dr. Baumgartner. Genius paper. Adam and Eve, design diversity and allele frequencies. Okay, and it goes in incredible depth. With a starting point of design diversity, and they go through numerical simulations, and it's beyond the scope of this short video that we're doing, but it's been done. The models have been worked out by very, very smart men, and these papers are not known by the evolutionist side. Like, for example, RJ Downard says that he's all up to date on this. He knows more about creation than creationists do, he says. In my debate with him, I asked him straightforward. I said, have you read this paper? Have you read this paper? He admitted, no, he hasn't. I said, what prediction are we making based on DNA function? For example, the cytochrome C, those DNA differences, what are we predicting that those are a result of? And he didn't know. And I pointed to protein moonlighting, protein multifunctionality. It's like a multifunctional tool. Like, these proteins are doing unimaginable tasks and functions in the genome that was never thought of or even heard of. Back in the 40s, one gene, one protein, one function. So these DNA differences in, for example, the cytochrome C or these highly conserved mitochondrial DNA proteins, they are not just, there's not just one basal function. There's multiple functions to these proteins. That are involved in information flow, metabolic optimization. For example, metabolic optimization will be different in a chimp and a human, will be different between a chimp, human, and a fish. That's where these DNA differences lie. And these are direct predictions that creationists are laying out. And RJ had to admit, no, we didn't know of this. So yeah, these evolutionists, even RJ, who says he's the best of the best, he's not even aware of these papers. So we are ahead of the game. We're the ones doing the science because we're making the testable predictions, evolutionists or not. It's a really fascinating time to be a young Earth creationist and to be an anti-evolutionist, as RJ would say. It's a great time.
So there's a question for you real quick, SFT by Redefine Living. Can you explain the arrival of the Y-chromosome from the evolutionary model?
Right, yeah, no, they can't explain it. I mean, they would pretty much have to say that the Y chromosome at this point in time is just decaying, and eventually it's going to decay out of our genome or something like that. But they have to, same thing with mitochondrial leave. They have to look to the fossil record, phylogeny-based assumptions to calibrate with the actual observed mutation rate. We can use pedigree-based studies. We can look at the empirical method, and the mutation accumulation in the mitochondrial DNA, the Y chromosome, only takes us back to a biblical time frame. It's amazing because the secular papers themselves will admit it, but then of course it's inconsistent with deep time evolution. So like I said, they got to calibrate it with the evolution time frame. The mitochondrial DNA, there's no mutation rate slow enough. Like with Erica, I kept asking her, what testable predictions can you make? Because we know Dr. Jensen made a prediction on the African people groups, the Khoisan peoples, whose mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA has not yet been measured. He said, this is how fast they're going to mutate. That's how confident he is with the consistent mutation rate found in non-African people groups. The evolutionists will have to invoke a mutation rate too slow, unobserved mutation rates. That's what they have to invoke. But then they admit that they can't make testable predictions. And it's simple. Evolutionists, when does the mutation rate slow down? When does it accelerate? Give us some. They're the ones that are saying the gold standard of science is that which is testable, that which is falsifiable, and they're failing miserably. I'll ask Godless Engineer if he watches this. Give me some testable predictions. I don't care about your storytelling. Evolutionists love to go back to the storyboard. We're not interested.
Right, he's a fanatical atheist and evolutionist. So here we go.
For them to be created with all this diversity, they cannot actually explain with the DNA how all those genes fit in there, because they would all need to. And then, of course, mutation and genetic drift and just basically how genetics works would have to work completely differently for Adam, Eve, and everybody else that came after that. But don't worry, we'll just throw some magic on this shit and that'll just fix everything right the fuck up. What this boils down to is a magical explanation for something that we know.
I mean, I don't want to stoop to his level though, but when he makes comments like magic and stuff, I mean, whoever believes, pond scum morphed into a whale, isn't that to me?
Exactly.
To me, that's mythology. I mean, if you believe that, I mean, is this guy projecting, trying to make fun of him? I mean, really, are you really going there? And
when I was debating Skylar Fiction, he said the same thing. Oh, magic this, magic that. I said, Skylar, did you have parents? He said, yes. I said, were they human? He said, yes. I said, did your parents have parents? He said, yes. I said, were they human? He's like, yeah, where are you going with this? I said, how far back do you have to go in time before humans become non-humans, for example? And he, sat there and a long pause. And he didn't have an answer, of course, because that's when they leave empirical, observable science and go into their fairy tale. And they will even admit at some point their ancestors were fish. It's single cell. For one, non-living chemicals somehow arrange themselves into the first life. There's magic. The origin of space, time, and matter. There's magic. There's single-celled bacteria like ancestor into a whale and all the living organisms we see on the planet today. Even though what we see in genetics is devolution and change that is down. And not only that, the most important part is the only assumption that we have regarding the created heterozygosity hypothesis is that God intended Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. Therefore, he front-loaded their DNA with pre-existing DNA differences. That's the only assumption. But guess what? It's not post hoc ad hoc. It's not magic, because now this explanation, this hypothesis leads to testable predictions on DNA function. Lo and behold, the ENCODE project has revealed that over 80% of the genome is actively transcribed into RNA, suggesting function. We can go on and on all day regarding the DNA elements, ERVs, ALUs. I mean, function is on our side, and that's a direct prediction. But speciation rates, mutation rates. So how is it magic? Praise. If our explanations are the ones leading to testable predictions,
right?
But theirs are not. Theirs are the ones that are, mutation rates in the mitochondrial DNA. They were so incredibly slower in the past than they are now. Okay,
but
what
also,
predictions can you make? Oh, we can't. That's magic.
Exactly. But also we believe in microevolution. That's testable, repeatable, and observable. You believe in some type of extreme, crazy, ad hoc fairy tale version of it called macroevolution. So yeah, tell us about a fairy tale. It's just pure shenanigans from brainless engineer here.
And actually in the chat, real quick, Sal made a good point, and also Mosh, PZ Myers, and Axel Mayer, and they're right. They say we still are fish. So yeah. You know, science means to know. What do we know? Well, we don't know that we're related to fish. And,
Frog
we're
and
not
Prince.
we're not going to go down that rabbit trail. But yeah, okay, continue, brother.
But isn't there a fairy tale of frog turning into a prince?
Exactly. So, you know, if I told you a frog turned to a prince due to a kiss from a princess, you'd say that's a fairy tale. But if I tell you a frog turned to a prince over millions of years and, you know, undirected mutational change, then suddenly that's science. No, they're both fairy tales.
Right.
Adding time to the
Same thing.
equation doesn't make it science.
Exactly. Here we go.
Is not magical. Standing for Truth thinks that we lose information over time and that all mutations are bad for us. He neglects to mention the good mutations that do happen that result in new structures, new features, new functionality. Ultimately, what we're getting to here is, how do you even determine what is a degradation and what's just a change in the genome?
You want to answer that, SFT?
Well, it's tough because we already answered it so thoroughly earlier.
Yeah.
Because anybody should, with common sense, will say, okay, if we've got a mutation that leads to disease, or there's all types of mutations, but a deletion, for example, that should imply a loss of some kind,
Function.
or a protein or a cell that's broken, obviously implies a loss of some kind, a loss of information. But yeah, even according to our model, we're talking about shifts. Because when we look back to the creation event, okay, as a creationist, we're looking back to the expansion of the genome. That was the time where animal kinds and Adam and Eve would have had the most front-loaded genetic diversity. They would have been the most heterozygous. Now, for example, like, and I brought this up to RJ, I say, why are horse species, why do they generally have more sites in their genome that are homozygous? Well, that should be expected because it's been thousands of years since the initial creation event. And of course, the flood bottleneck, which I don't even have to get into, which would have been one generation, very little of that initial heterozygosity would have been lost. A little bit would have been lost, of course, but it's one generation followed by rapid exponential population growth. So, and very limited mutation accumulation as well. So yeah, I mean, we covered genetic degeneration quite a bit earlier, but I mean, we can see it in the world. It's entropic degeneration on all levels. A lot of it is environmental and epigenetic as well, but I mean, we've got cancers on the rise, Alzheimer's, dementia, autoimmune diseases, immunological diseases. It's, like I said, I'll ask Godless Engineer, and Sal's really good at this. He always asks the evolutionists this question: do you truly believe that humans are getting better? And no one in their right mind could admit that they are.
Genetic disorders. There's a bunch of genetic. What about loss of function too? That's how you can tell.
Oh, right. He said that. Yeah. So he never gave any actual examples of like new structures and body plans and things like that. But that's not even important to me, because I talk about the net gain versus net loss, because instead of arguing all day about, whether or not, this example that they can give you is truly a beneficial mutation with no deleterious effects associated with it at all. Who cares? You can have 1, 2, you can have 5. It doesn't matter, because 1, 2, or 5 truly beneficial mutations is not going to counterbalance the accumulating damage based on the influx, the incredible influx of deleterious mutations. I mean, and the more functional our genome is, the more deleterious these mutations become. That's why it's better to refer to them as nearly neutral, because the genome, the non-coding regions, for example, are incredibly functional. So we'll save that for a bit later. But yeah, keep going, brother.
All right, guys, let's get going. I'm sorry about that, Gav. I didn't even check back there. Here we go.
I would love for you, Standing for Truth, to explain to me the difference between just a change in the genetic code and actual degradation of the genetic code.
If these studies she talked about had the assumption that both models predict nests and hierarchical patterns, they wouldn't have come to the conclusions that they did. Evolutionists explain the vast majority of DNA differences as a result of mutation, and this is the way that they look at it.
Yes, I would agree. Ultimately, mutation is a primary driver behind evolution, but you also have other mechanisms that help move these mutations in genes throughout a population, like natural and sexual selection, along with genetic drift, all help genes move throughout a population. So it's not just mutations, it's also the flow of alleles in a population.
This one genetic difference and starting point leads to vastly different expectations and predictions on DNA function and speciation. Every single one of Erica's genetic related evidence for universal common ancestry that she pointed to in her opening here have been overturned, and I'm happy to discuss every single one of them. The lines of evidence Erica uses are evidence for this model of created heterozygosity. I'm glad she brought them up. Since both creationists and evolutionists expect nested hierarchical patterns in anatomy, physiology, and genetics, and we both expect homologous patterns, and we both expect types of creatures that can best be explained as mosaic or, in a sense, transitional. I can demonstrate that the function of DNA can differentiate between the two models.
Well, see, you can't actually show that it will differentiate between the two models, because if both models predict those exact same things, then you have no way in differentiating them. But on creationism, we should expect to see specially created structures, and we just don't see that. Also, another
I doubt what he said there, specially created features. Well, what about the flagellar motor?
Laminin. Something as simple as laminin. Laminin holds us together. It's in the shape of a cloth.
Sorry to interrupt, guys. Praise Salvador's in the chat and he's salivating like one of Pavlov's dogs to get into the room.
Oh yeah, are you kidding? I'd love to get Sal in here.
Yeah,
Sal's an awesome.
Hey, let's do this because we're let's try and get through the whole video, and then, like I said, we'll just open it up, just so we can get through this video, and then we'll open it up to a free flowing dialogue.
Good idea.
The thing in the evolutionary theories corner is the fact that we can trace organisms back to before they turned into whatever kind you want to talk about. Like, for instance, whales. Whales are my go-to animal because they can be traced back to land quadrupeds. Now, those are radically different than whales and dolphins now. The fact that we can trace whales and dolphins back to land quadrupeds shows that your particular hypothesis here doesn't actually work. Now, if you agree that a land quadruped eventually turned into a whale, then that kind of throws a big wrench in your whole kinds idea, because there's no way that I would lump a land quadruped
Actually, pause it real quick
with a
there,
whale if you're going with the creation.
So the reason why we say that homologous patterns, for example, even mosaics and nested hierarchical patterns are agnostic, and therefore we need to look at that which is differentiating, is pretty straightforward, because those lines of evidence, they do not work since both models can explain the data. It's like saying this, hey, the sky is blue or the earth is a sphere, therefore creation is wrong. It's like, what? Both models explain the shape of the earth and the blueness of the sky. What does that really have to do with the debate? And also, if God, as we're proposing, created Adam and Eve with these pre-existing functional DNA differences, and this applies universally across species, that means if you looked at the initial created event, you would already see nested hierarchical patterns in DNA, anatomy, and morphology. Okay, so if a scientist showed up to the creation event an hour after and didn't know that these animals and Adam and Eve were created and started doing genomic analyses or anatomical comparisons or looking at morphology, they will conclude, oh wow, nested hierarchical patterns, this seems to fit descent with modification, even though this was the creation event. So when we say that, hey, we read in the Bible that we're made in God's image, therefore we should get a sense for the way God created the biological world by looking at the way we design things. And it just turns out that we also design in nested hierarchical patterns. patterns accidentally. We're not doing it on purpose, but we see these groups within groups patterns in modes of transportations, for example. They naturally form these groups within groups patterns. A sedan, for example, I say this all the time. A sedan has a tremendous amount of similarities with other sedans. Now bring in a semi-tractor trailer. It's obviously much different than a sedan or a car, but these two modes of transportation are similar enough to each other that it sets them apart from boats or airplanes, for example. This is the groups within groups pattern. So these things are agnostic. Function, for example, is what can really differentiate between the models. Even if you look down to the material level of these modes of transportation, the metals used, the materials used, those will look at the tires on an airplane and a sedan. You're going to find nested hierarchical patterns everywhere. Now, what's funny though is there still is inconsistencies in their models, because they'll spend a great deal of time saying, trying to point out inconsistencies in the hierarchical patterns in modes of transportation. But guess what? Every time the evolutionist invokes convergent evolution or loss of traits evolution or incomplete lineage sorting, they're admitting an inconsistency in the phylogenetic tree of life, because they're admitting implicitly that, let's say, convergent evolution, they're looking at a certain biological feature and they're admitting that this does not follow the expected taxonomy. One example I want to give is, despite the apparent outward similarity of, say, marsupial moles and placental moles, they're not actually classified together. Instead, marsupial moles group with creatures like kangaroos and placental moles group with creatures like llamas. So despite their outward resemblance that we can look at, these animals belong to very different taxonomic categories. And based on their modes of reproduction, this just completely contradicts the expected taxonomy. So yeah, overall there are these patterns, but there are inconsistencies with them. But most importantly, yeah, we're making specific predictions on the patterns. We're looking at mitochondrial proteins. The classic biochemical functions of mitochondrial proteins are well known. But the thing is, we're saying, are these really these classic biochemical functions? Are they the only functions for these proteins? For example, the cytochrome C. How do we know that these differences that they say are a marker of time and inform nested patterns consistent with descent with modification? How do we know that these proteins from separate kinds that are different from each other, can we really say that they're functionally neutral based on what we know about protein moonlighting and protein multifunctionality? We're predicting they're metabolically optimized, they're involved in information flow, and this is a testable prediction on paper that future observations and future tests can tell us if it's true or not. So yeah, they can complain all they want, but we're the ones, again, praise, we're the ones making the prediction. And one last thing, even Herman Mays will look to amino acid trees and neutral variation and say these codons, third position codon, degenerate codons, form nested hierarchies. Well, guess what? Now we know that these third position codons are not as functionally neutral as they said. They work to help speed and slow the process. They help in information flow, for example. So these codons, these third position codons, are expected to reflect taxonomy and function. So function is in our court. That is why the evolutionist is on the defense. Jason, sorry, brother, take your time.
Oh yeah, what I was just going to say is that they make up most of their functions and their mutations. They make them up, so they just make them up off the top of their head. So they just go, okay, so we haven't got the mutation rates are far too fast. We need to slow it down. So we'll go to the drawing board for 10 years and fiddle around and do a whole lot of mathematical equations and then come out with some imagination of what it would have been in the past, sort of thing. But they go against their own what's happening in the present. The way to check what's happening in the past is what's happening in the present. But that doesn't sort of wash.
Yeah, I also object to his will evolution claim too. I'm seeing that shenanigans with that too, because we even have evidence of hoaxes. There's a guy named Phil Gingrich who was caught red-handed. He even admitted to that he was filing down bones to make this ambliocetus or I think in this rotocetus. And so if this whale evolution is so well substantiated, why the heck is this Phil Gingrich making hoaxes for whale evolution? I say bogus. That's bogus, a bogus claim. Hooey on that.
Yeah, I think Standing for Truth dropped out.
Oh.
There's
There's CFT.
Yeah, I heard the echo again, so I thought, you know what, I'll drop out. And oh yeah, he did bring up transitional forms, eh? I guess that's the only thing we didn't address. Yeah, I mean, you just addressed the whale evolution, but even if, I guess, to leave no stone unturned, we would also expect mosaics. You've heard me say it before, Tiktaalik, Archaeopteryx, if you'd like, or the reptile-like mammals that RJ is so obsessed with and has written a book over. But we know that we look, once again, we're made in God's image. Let's look at the design world. What do we build? And it just so happens that we build that which is quote unquote transitional. Look at amphibious assault vehicles. Blend the features of both a military vehicle for the land and for the oceans, or even these crossover SUVs. Literally, these crossover SUVs, they blend the features of a van and an SUV, and it's hard to even classify them, for example. But majority proves the rule. Yeah, they can point to one or two so-called transitional forms.
Yeah, like the
But the rule is there should be a lot more. And even the ones, if you really dissect them and go in deep and look at it, like the whales, for example, those presumed transitional forms that Godless Engineer is looking to, Ambulocetus, Rotocetus, Pakicetus, they're all highly questionable, easily debunked. The claim that these are all whale precursors, supposedly, is based on speculation, wishful thinking. The fossil evidence is so fragmentary, and even Pakicetus. I mean, they used to say and assume and illustrate this tiny little dog-like animal as a fully aquatic mammal, and now we know that it's undergone an incredible change. It's been revised, and now they portray it as just an ordinary land mammal. And Tiktaalik, so all of these so-called transitionals too, even though, like I said, we do predict some mosaics, they suffer from what's called the grandfather paradox. So they looked at Tiktaalik, okay? And even though they say it's, transitioning from water to land, those claimed tetrapod traits, quote unquote, they are consistent with many living and even extinct lobe fin fish species today. And after the discovery, I think it was 20 years after, maybe 50 years, in Poland, they've got tracks from tetrapods that actually predate Tiktaalik by over 20 million years. So grandfather paradox abounds. And yeah, I mean, the arguments he's using are just so easily, it's all based on speculation, artistic license, especially with these fossils, artistic misrepresentation, actually. So yeah, what are your thoughts, guys?
I have a question for Godless Engineer. Maybe he can address this if he ever has the gall to, or the gumption to. Tell me.
He will if he thinks.
Yeah, I don't think he will. I mean, I challenge you. So, Godless Engineer, my question is, how can a land mammal evolve into a whale when the reproductive organs are on the outside of a land mammal, and how do they get on the inside of a whale perfectly snugged in and with the perfect temperature? It's patently impossible. You can't have reproductive organs on the outside to go and then evolve in the inside. And that's how evolution works too.
Blood flow and all sorts of stuff to take away heat, like
right.
Because they're inside, it needs increased blood flow, and all sorts of things have to happen. It's not just tuck them away and make it waterproof. There's a lot of mechanisms and things that need to be in place to keep it all working properly. It's like their pelvis, the two little bones in there, that the reproductive organs attached to those two little bones. And if they didn't have those two little bones, well, there would be no whales because they go extinct. They wouldn't be able to make.
Right, that's
exactly.
the whole point.
There'd be no babies.
You need to make babies for evolution to work. So how can that even work? Brainless Engineer.
It was so funny how badly Kent cornered Godless Engineer on that topic regarding the so-called vestigial hind legs. and how they're used for copulation, reproductive purposes. But yeah, it's just like the junk DNA paradigm. All these pseudogenes, all these non-functional ERVs, and so on and so forth. And they do the same with these so-called vestigial organs and vestigial structures. No, they're all there for a purpose. They all have a function. And like Jason said, you know, these bones are important for reproductive purposes. So I guess if they weren't there, according to the evolutionists, there'd be no whale babies. So yeah, it's crazy. It hinders science, is what it does.
It does. And teaching people that they used to be legs. It used to be part of a pelvis.
Walking whales.
It's hilarious. It's like, you know, like if you didn't know any better and you saw that, then you know, you could see that that's okay, fair enough. I could see that. You could think to yourself, but then when you learn what they're actually for, it's like saying that your tailbone, if your tailbone was, I love the way Ken Oven always says, and I love saying this, if you want to have your tailbone removed, I will pay for it. You know, I'll pay for the surgery to have
Exactly. And you know what? Actually, we could take that. We could take that and apply it to the genome. Like what I spent hours, like even in my second debate with Erica, you know, we spent almost an hour just discussing. Well, her position is that less than 25% of the genome is functional, and the majority is junk. Okay, why don't you volunteer yourself to science and have 80% of your genome just removed? Just knock it all out.
Yeah.
You'll be fine. And I will pay you to do it, just like with the tailbone, right?
There's one gene that they've, I can't remember which one it is, that we've got in that's only in humans, that's not in mice. So usually what they do is they knock out a gene in mice to see if it affects them or whatever. Because it's not in mice, that they can't test it, that they'd need a human to do it. And I remember there was one, I think it was Speed of Sound, that was saying that, you know, that this gene isn't important and all that sort of stuff. And we're like, okay, well, go and volunteer yourself to NCIB or whatever it is, and volunteer to have that part of your gene knocked out, and you prove to us all that it's just not important. And it has been found to be important in a lot of things, but you know, like they won't. They'll sit there and argue blue in the face that it's not important. But you know, when it comes down, like if we paid for it to have that gene knocked out for him, for them, or they'd pay for it. Actually, they do it for, you know what I mean, like for scientific research, they pay for it.
Yeah, exactly.
Do it.
For scientific advancement, go have 80% of your genome knocked out. And what's funny, it brings me to mind too.
And that's only one little part of the genome, and he wouldn't do it, Stanley.
Yeah,
that's only one tiny little part, you know, and he wouldn't do that. One tiny little part, as if he's going to knock out 80%. None of them would.
It was Richard Dawkins who said, before the ENCODE project, he said, you know, 90% of our genome may as well not even be there. And then afterwards, he had to correct his statement and say, oh, this is exactly what we'd expect to find. But what's funny is, when I was debating RJ Downer, I see him asking in debates with other people, like, you know, ALUs, how do you explain ALUs, ERVs, you know, how many were in Adam and Eve and stuff like that. So we finally get to that topic, and I love that topic. And he actually said, I don't know if he did it on purpose. No, I don't think he actually said, when he was cornered, he said, you know, I'm not prepared for that. It's like, well, why you always, you know, you're supposed to be the expert at this. But there was a part where I told him about that class of retrotransposon found in the mouse embryo. And I told him that if you deactivate this, the mouse embryo develops and then it stops. And I told him the reason for this is because that mouse embryo depends on the function of that specific class of retrotransposon, which RJ, you know, would assume is junk. And I said, explain that. And there was literally must have been 5 seconds of silence. And he said a couple times, he's like, oh, Erica told me you'd ask this question. And I said, okay, well, what answer did Erica tell you to give me? He didn't have one. So it just shows, man, that everything genetics just points to, I mean, the genetic structure, the DNA function, there's, like I said before, there's traces of Adam and Eve in our genetics. And the more that you study it, the more that you uncover that fact.
Hey, SNT, I don't mean to cut you up, but we got Brother Sal with us, and yeah, we're really looking forward to his commentary.
Hey, Brother Sal, good to have. Always a pleasure, brother. Always a pleasure. We call you the evolution destroyer, Sal.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I've just been listening to you all. You guys are actually doing the heavy lifting of Young Earth Creationism. Even though I'm a young Earth creationist, I actually don't do a lot of work in defending the model. Most of my role is actually seeing is the old traditional anti-evolutionism. And
Right.
I usually go around digging for things that they've said that actually destroy their own theory. And that makes my job easier, because I think someone challenged me to debate, and I said, well, you're going to have a hard time because I'm just going to quote your literature.
Oh, that's a great point, Sal. You can destroy them with their own literature. Like, for example, in my last debate with RJ Downard, who we know is as aggressive as it gets, I brought 99% secular sources and pedigree-based mitochondrial DNA mutation rate studies. And he kept saying over and over again, only creationists say that. And it's like, do you not see these papers, multiple papers from your own secular journals that are saying mitochondrial DNA mutation rates go back only 6,000 years? And the DNA function arguments on the ALUs, the ERVs that I showed him, once again, all from their own literature. So you make a great point. Their own literature.
What's really bad in this part of my job is just to track what's happening between the medical community. It's quiet. There's been quietly a war between the medical research community and the evolutionary biologists, and it's really been kind of hilarious to watch it. They were just having a meltdown with the results of ENCODE, and they're trying to call for the defunding of ENCODE. They're calling them crooks and all. Well, I'm pleased to announce ENCODE had several follow-on projects, probably $500 million budget. So, oh well, they got ignored.
Oh no!
I can name them off with the Roadmap Epigenomics Program, Mouse ENCODE, Psych ENCODE, 4D Nucleome, E4 Epitranscriptome. I mean, just like it's not going to end anytime soon. So the next 10 years could be really funny, because I'm just so glad they went out on a limb and we're just saying all this DNA, the ALUs, the signs, the lines, the ERVs are junk. I said, I'm so glad you guys went on record, because we're not going to ever let you guys forget it. Because in the next 10 years, God willing, if the Lord tarries and civilization doesn't melt, we're going to have so much evidence, because God's on our side. And,
Amen. Amen.
So I probably, it may be, I do get flack sometimes, because I tend to be a little bit critical of my young Earth creationist brethren, because I'm quite a bit more circumspect. That's why I hang out with guys like Speed of Sound. He's actually God bless him, he's actually teaching me organic chemistry. So if you're listening in, I want to thank him for inspiring me, and I pray for him.
We enjoy Speed. And you know what? It's good to be critical. Well, I mean, I spend a lot of time not only, and I recommend it. I spend a lot of time reading technical papers from secular journals, but I do read a lot of papers from creationist journals too, like a lot. And they are constantly critical of each other's models. I mean, you get Todd Wood, Kurt Wise, Nathaniel Jensen, John Sanford, and Robert Carter all in the same room. There's going to be disagreements, but that's what advances science. And that's what advances the young Earth creation model as well. We're not all clones. We're not all going to agree on the exact same thing. And there's multiple hypotheses there, and they're testing them, we're testing them. So I think being critical of each other in a respectful fashion, I think that's what advances science, to be honest with you.
Hey, SFT, real quick before you guys, I have to go for a few minutes, but I put the link into the chat, and if you could share really quick, you could stop and start when you want to, and it starts at 12:21, so that's where you want to leave off at and go.
Actually, You know what? I have seen the rest of it. So because we have a full stream here, and I've gotten emails and requests to debunk this video, what I'm going to do is, I know what the final part is. It's about Adam's genome exactly. I'm going to just spend 2-3 minutes just refuting the last part. If you want, I think we've taken care of the first 3/4 of this quite well, but we have a nice open hangout where we can all talk. So what I'll do, Praise, are you still there?
Yeah, yep.
I'm just
we'll just go mute while you do that.
Yeah, I'm just going to spend 2-3 minutes and refute the last part he has. And then you can just shut it down, and we'll leave Godless Engineers video in the description box, whoever wants to watch the last 8 minutes or so. then we'll just leave it open for free-flowing dialogue because we got Sal here who's a genius. I'd like us to just talk and not spend all night.
Q&As, yeah. I bet you people in the chat will have a lot of questions, and you guys can answer that.
Okay, so yeah, let me just refute his last part. Like, so he's, well, not only him, RJ Downer, there, like all of these ardent militant evolutionists, you know, they're saying that when it comes to Adam and Eve, it would be impossible to get this much diversity in just 6,000 years from two people, Adam and Eve. That's what it boils down to. We went over how that assumes all diversity is a result of mutation. It rejects front-loaded genetic diversity. But most importantly, we can just look at all the people around the world. And I've gotten this from secular sources as well. I've gotten this from this paper here where Dr. Sanford and Dr. Carter are involved. Adam and Eve, Design Diversity, Allele Frequencies. Highly recommend it, but there are about 10 million variants, more or less, like I said, but these are very, very common, and most importantly, they're not disease causing for the most part. So the question is, do we assume these are mutations, or is this just that? Is that just an assumption? Because those could be the variants that God engineered in Adam, the created heterozygosity hypothesis that we've been talking about. So, for example, we carry 2 copies of all our DNA, okay? To break it down for the audience, if you look at any piece of DNA that we got from, say, our mother and our fathers, we have 2 copies of, say, let's use chromosome 1. For example, now if you scan down chromosome 1, okay, you're going to find places where your 2 versions have different letters. Maybe the one that you got from your father, let's say, is an A, and the one from your mother is a T. Maybe in another location, you scan down, you look, we got a C from dad, we get a G from our mother. And I'm just simplifying this for sake of time, but this variation is actually found all around the world. We discussed earlier about allele frequencies and the distribution of allele frequencies. We talked about Y-chromosome and the geographically specific nature of them. But you and I, so let's say me and Sal, me and Praise, we have about 3 million places, more or less, not exact, of course, I don't want to be exact, but for the point being, about 3 million places where the copy we got from our mother differs from the copy we got from our father. Now, if we carry 3 million differences, okay, Godless engineer, it's not a stretch at all to say that Adam carried 10 million. Because remember, okay, we only carry a subset of the world's diversity. Put the world's diversity, those 10 million variants, into Adam, and over time, okay, this is pretty basic, those genetic variants spread out. Those 10 million variants are found all over China, all over Europe, all over Africa, all over the entire world. It's about the allele frequencies, like I've said. The ones that are rare are most likely mutations. The ones that are common are most likely design. Function is what we look at. But why is this? So this is because these variants were in our population before we spread out. This means those variants were on the ark, and ultimately this means they were in Adam. So it really is just as simple as that. This is pretty much the answer to his questions and the rest of his video. He does go into one part near the end where he talks about if there's too much front-loaded genetic diversity, it'll be genome overload. But that assumes that all that information is expressed at the same time, which is not true. We know that many non-coding RNA genes, such as pseudogenes, are only expressed under various conditions, various environmentally related conditions. So that's just another misunderstanding of basic genetics. But that's more or less answers the rest of his video and kind of just his entire video as a whole. So if he has a problem with that, he can either do a response video or just debate me on this topic because I find it fascinating. But yeah, that's all I have to say. And Praise, if you want to just remove the video and we can open this up for dialogue. And if anyone has any specific questions in the audience that we can't get to here or I didn't answer in the first hour and a half, just email me and I'll do what I can. Okay, guys? Thanks for the patience. Enough from me.
Enough from you. So what do you? Anyway, so what's happening there is Is it still live on Watsy, or I don't understand.
Oh yeah. I'm just saying this concluded the Godless
Yeah,
Engineer.
yeah. Oh, the video part. Yeah.
We're still live.
No, I was
We're
just
still
going to say.
live. Unless you guys had any questions about what I said, but if you want more details, yeah, I've got plenty of. For the scope of this video, like you can look at.
I was just wondering that if it was possible to do that, to start it off and like cut that video off, and while you're still live, and then start off another one. That'd be awesome if you could do that one.
Start a whole new stream.
Yeah, because I don't know, because don't you want that to be part, like just that to be refuting Godless Engineer? This is going to be attached to it, isn't it?
You're right. I guess that's up to Praise.
You want to start another? Just ask Praise. Praise, is it all right? Do you want to start another discussion, or?
I think what I'll do is in the description box, I'll say from this time frame to this. I'll say from this time frame to this time frame, rebuttal to Godless Engineer, and then from this time frame to this time frame, open discussion. So then, if he does want to respond to this video, he'll know where to look. You know, I think he's smart enough to at least do that.
Yeah, no, that's easy enough. Yeah, that's right. All right. No, I just wondered that's what you wanted. I just wondered if there was an option to do that. That's all. Obviously not. So yeah.
And I think, to be honest with you, I think we've responded in more detail than is enough for his video, and answered his question more than. So I hope that kind of cleared up the model, but yeah. So
it's pretty nonsense, nonsense stuff anyway. So what he's saying, that is, it's not real hard to refute.
Well, they just don't realize that work has been done.
The best quote is DNA is like Diet Coke. Oh my goodness, I don't think we ever want to let him live that one down.
Well, hey, that's why we made that the template. Could you imagine a debate, Salvador, highly intellectual individual versus Godless Engineer who believes DNA is like Diet Coke?
Yeah, we would never.
I'd be scared for him, Sal.
Well, I try not to be too polemic, but someone, because I, like you could see, I get along really well with Speed of Sound. Just love the guy, and I pray for a lot of atheists, and because some of them were my professors, so I guess I come from a different perspective, because so many of them. I'll tell you a funny story. Richard Dawkins' drinking pal was my professor in grad school.
No
and he
way.
didn't know I was a creationist. So I don't know. I guess I just come from a mold where my neighbor, all the people that were sort of mentoring me through my education were atheists and agnostics and non-creationists, and I just ended up loving them to death, because part of the reason I became a creationist was because of them. So I don't know that I would rub it into his face too much. That's just, if someone needs to be called out, I'll call them out on it. And if they're asking for it, if they're saying I'm stupid, I'll just call them out on it, and said, well, I'm not the one who said DNA.
Godless Engineer. Yeah, that's right. Godless Engineer says some really stupid things. I mean, you watch his videos and you're sort of ripping your hair out by the time you get to the 5th minute. There's so many things. Yeah,
I wanted.
It's just one thing after the other after the other. He doesn't know what he's talking about at all. About anything.
There are some interesting developments, and maybe I'm thinking I'd like to contribute some lectures to the Standing for Truth channel, because Dr. Sanford and I got rejected in another publication again. So, we're marked men, and so it's kind of nice that I'm trying to find venues where we could finally just tell the truth. I'm personally getting tired of just trying to deal with editors of science journals. We can publish if we're publishing on medical research, because anything to do with cancer research, if it's good research, they'll let it go, even if we're creationists. But when we even are mildly critical of evolutionary theory, even just quoting what they themselves say about their own theory, we just get rejected. Yeah, so just, so it's really nice to have a place I could share some of it. But I just wanted to mention there's some exciting stuff coming on the horizon. It looks like there may be coded messages. The thing that coded messages in the gene sequences across species. So for the longest time, the evolutionary biologists have been hammering us over the nested hierarchies. And it may be, and it's troubled me a long time because I used to be an evolutionist. And even when I became a young Earth creationist, I said, why would God make us so similar to monkeys in certain genes? Because when I browse genomes, specific genes that I'm studying or proteins, I'm always shocked how similar we are to chimpanzees. There are two answers to that. One of them is God created these creatures in part to help us understand we're fearfully and wonderfully made. Because if you saw some of the experiments that they do at places like the National Institutes of Health or some of these pharmaceutical companies, you'll be so grateful that God made mammals like rats and mice and chimpanzees and dogs and pigs. Because if you saw the experiments that we did do on them, like drilling holes in their brain and then sticking in probes and making them walk, you'd be just praising God every day for these creatures, because we're able to learn that we're fearfully and wonderfully made because of this nested hierarchy. And I began to have peace about that, because for a while I was like, God, you made it so hard to believe in creation because you made us so similar to chimps. And now I'm realizing, thank God, so that's one. But there's now a secret code that structural biologists are finding. We can actually now start to predict 3D structure. If we take, like, say, a cytochrome C, actually, there are better examples, like, say, beta-lactamase. That's a better one. Proteins that span across species, if we put them through an artificial intelligence machine, do something known as a direct coupling analysis, we could solve protein folding, which is just like, that didn't have to be in biology. That is just like so cool. And so this is something I can talk about later, but that was always the thing that kind of hung me up. People that are creationists began to lose their faith because of that kind of that nested hierarchy. But we're starting to get a breakthrough there. So I just wanted to share that.
I don't know. I think Standing for Truth might have fallen asleep or something. I don't know what time it is.
Hey guys, so I put in the side chat. I had to run upstairs real quick. I got the kids upstairs sleeping, and my daughter, anytime she runs out of water, she starts a crying. So yeah, sorry about that. I missed the last few minutes. What did you guys want to, like? I know, Sal, you were talking about structural biology, or like, how do you feel about, I guess, anything maybe Godless Engineer said, or something you'd like to explain, teach the audience, teach us?
Yeah, I'm going to be trying to put together some lectures for you all, because I'd like to contribute and help you guys. I'm not, even though I'm a young Earth creationist, it's not been the focus of what I've been tasked to do. So I'll share some of the research. But I was saying the nested hierarchy, it's not well known that Michael Denton used to be an old Earth creationist. And when he saw the nested hierarchy as he's going through medical school, that led to his atheism. But ironically, as he studied the question of evolution more carefully, he became kind of in between, and he wrote his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. And that ended up being one of the founding books of the modern intelligent design movement. So this whole thing of a nested hierarchy had troubled me as a creationist. I used to be an evolutionist, and then even as a young Earth creationist, I was thinking, well, Lord, why did you make us so similar to chimpanzees? And why does it seem to follow almost like I can see it in the gene sequences? It almost looks like transitions.
Right.
But there are problems with that, which deal with orphan genes, and that's just a really powerful argument. But the thing that there are two things that are becoming important now. It looks like one of the reasons God created all these creatures is that they are what they call model organisms. So that's the way we actually understand the puzzle of human biology, is to study these creatures, because each of the creatures has a piece of the puzzle. So if you saw all the experiments we do at the NIH and at various pharma and biotech companies, you'd be so grateful that God made creatures similar to us. I mean, you'd be thanking God every day. Because at first I was like, Lord, you're making my job as a creationist so hard, you know? And then I realized, oh, thank God for these primates. And actually, John Sanford, I think I'm free to say this. He was saying, you know, he said he wishes they did more work using chimpanzees and primates as model organisms, because they are very similar to us. We would probably get better results for some of our, you know, some of the stuff that's getting ready to be rolled out, because they are so similar. And I was thinking, this is great, because I one time did a report on neurons, and I asked, how did they get this data on the neuron cell? They said, oh, we got it from embryonic stem cells from an aborted fetus. I was just like crushed. So we don't have to do that, you know? God gave us creatures that can be sacrificed in our place, and that's an Old Testament theme.
Actually, that's a good point. That is a good point.
Now, so that explains a little bit of the hierarchy, but the really exciting stuff is now that, like in the last 5 years, you know, protein structure is really important, because the pharmaceutical companies are very interested in structure, because the way that these molecules are folded and shaped and their size predicts a lot of their chemical behavior. And so there's an obsession with structural biology. That's you know, where they're actually studying the chemical structure and its biological significance. So if we can solve the protein folding problem, we could have a lot of pharmaceutical and medical breakthroughs. But it turns out in the last 5 years, if we take all these, if you've seen these sequence alignments of genes like cytochrome C and other genes,
yes,
they pump these through artificial intelligence machines and what they call a process of direct coupling analysis, where they study code variations between the amino acid residues. You can pump it through this, and they discovered you could predict protein folding. You can predict protein folding. I have maybe I'll give a talk on that.
I would love that.
This is like a hidden code. This is like a hidden code in biology, and explains why God made a nested hierarchy within each protein family. It's like a hidden code that could only be discovered by 21st century technology and supercomputers. It's like he foresaw this day. So I'm very excited about that, because the intelligent design argument is really it's beginning to really just start to crush evolutionary biologists. It's getting to the point some of them don't even want to challenge me on some things. So I like it when I can have a debate and it's over in the first 30 seconds.
Well, hey, if I was an evolutionist, I wouldn't want to challenge you either. But yeah, that's fascinating about the protein folding in relation to the nested hierarchies. Because I agree. I think that, especially in these amino acid trees, for example, or these highly conserved mitochondrial DNA proteins that form the hierarchies, the cytochrome C, for example, or the CO1 gene. Yeah, I agree that would be one of their better lines of evidence. But how you explained it, and how science and knowledge on DNA function is, I guess, advancing these. Sorry, go ahead, Sal.
I was about to say, I forgot to say, it's not just protein foldings. RNAs actually also fold, and they're doing the same thing with RNAs.
Oh,
so
it just gets worse and worse for them, doesn't it?
Oh, it's like, this is why the design argument. It's like, we need to stop looking at it as common descent for just as an of what unifies biology. What unifies biology is the common design optimized for scientific discovery, and so that we can understand we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and that there is a creator, as it says in Romans, that his invisible attributes are revealed by what is made. And not only are the differences in the gene sequence actually very species specific, because a lot of times it's optimized for their biology.
Yeah, metabolically optimized.
Right, but it's also optimized for us to learn about ourselves. So it's really funny. We study yeast, we'll study plants, we'll study worms, the nematodes, we'll study squid, zebrafish. Each of them has a small piece of the puzzle for how human biology works. And each of these organisms, these model organisms, are exquisitely created to help us with one feature of our puzzle, because we can't study the human cell if we didn't have these other pieces of the puzzle. It's like God gave a piece of us to all these other creatures so we could learn about ourselves. So when we want to study embryology, bird eggs are just really ideal because you can break them open and you can watch just all these things. And people are always saying, how remarkable it is we have this creature that could help us. So like when we were studying nerves, we used to study squids. They're perfectly optimized to help us because they had these very big, what they call axons in the nerve cell that enabled us to put wire probes and stuff inside of them, which is very hard to do with human neurons. So we're living in a very exciting time. And each time I look at biology, I think, wow, you just want to worship God every day.
You do. And even just, I guess what I'm about to say is a little more basic regarding the hierarchies, but I find that, like, for example, Aaron Ra has what's called a phylogeny challenge, right? Where does the phylogeny break down kind of thing? But I just find this funny because they assume that God would have created humans in like a completely separate category, and humans are different. Different to the chimp and different to the fish, equally distant to all other forms of life, which doesn't make any sense. It makes sense that God would create some creatures that are more similar to each other and some creatures that are less similar to each other. So this whole groups within groups pattern of life, it really is a basic fundamental principle of biology, but it makes sense from a design perspective. And like you pointed out, the similarities in DNA, for example, helps us learn and explore details that we really could only know now with the advancements that we're seeing. So you're right. It's a really fascinating time to be not only a Christian, but a creationist.
Yes. And what's amazing is it's like there are multiple codes, what they call polyconstraints. Dr. Sanford used that term, polyconstraints, polyfunctional. To be able to do this with both RNA and proteins at the same time.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
It's just mind-blowing. One thing that I really get, a really easy way to defend common design and argue against common ancestry. There hasn't been an evolutionary biologist yet who is able to refute this. I'll ask them. I said, okay, so let's just take a different question as to instead of one universal common ancestor as an organism, can you name a universal common gene from which all genes descended? All of them will say no. So I said, well,
that's a good question. That's a good question.
And I began to realize once I started saying that, people just started smiling around the creationist side. They said, that's a really good question. Because they'll be talking about they'll say, oh, we have these hidden Markov models that show universal common ancestry. And I'll say, well, what happens if you put all the protein families together? What happens to your hidden Markov models and all your, all your nested hierarchies? It's like it's gone. It's just blown away. Said, so what you're saying is all the major protein families, even though they may be, give rise to trees, it looks like an orchard. Doesn't that look like a creationist model? It looks like an orchard. Because and it's like, no one's going to challenge you on that. And I said, okay, so then if it has an orchard, where did that orchard begin? Because you can't invoke universal common ancestry to the first gene. I mean, you know, we're starting to tally a little bit what all the major protein families might be because of Craig Ventnor's work on, he claimed he made life, which he didn't, but he did figure out an estimate of what the minimal genome should look like. And it's like, well, you know, I would guess there'd be several, I could probably plot several orchards right there that, you know, one gene doesn't, you know, he found like what, 400 some genes, 400 to 500 some genes that are absolutely required. We could probably organize those into families, and you could see they have no common descent. You could pump it into a hidden Markov model or any of these evolutionary tree building things, and you're not going to find a tree.
Well, it's right. That's exactly what it looks like is an orchard. And it's like you mentioned it earlier briefly, the orphan genes. That is a huge problem for their nested hierarchy, because when it comes to animal origins, according to their evolutionary model, those novel DNA sequences, those orphan genes, and then you know, the unique traits that are often associated with them, they what? You know, they suddenly appear, they're fully functional without any trace of evolutionary history, like you were pointing at, Sal. You know, where did these pop up from? That's why they're called orphans. There's no evidence for any type of ancestry with them.
Hey guys, I'm back.
Hey, Praise, thank you for helping me join. So I'm really sorry that I can't participate too much in the Young Earth creation debate. You know, there are people that are more qualified than I am. Actually, you guys are better at that than I am. So, you know, I can only share kind of for what my specialty is, which is protein structure and anti-evolutionary arguments by the secular community themselves. So,
Yeah. I had a question for Sal though. If he had time, I'd like to ask him a question.
No, Praise. No, you're not allowed to ask questions. You're just a producer. That's it. Pretend you're not even. I'm just kidding. Ask away, brother.
So my question is, like, with natural selection, which paradigm do you think, Sal, would that fit in better? That it's more coherent, the creationist one or the evolutionary one?
Oh. The creationist one, and it's very interesting. Darwin actually plagiarized Edward Blythe, who most people believe is a creationist. And Blythe, there's an interesting book by Loren Eiseley, who was the provost of the University of Pennsylvania. So he's just a really senior guy. And he published something out. He wanted it published posthumously because he's going to get pushback. He argued that Darwin had plagiarized Blythe. So I think natural selection is a feature of life that God created, but it is insufficient to evolve things. And the distinction is natural selection actually prevents evolution. It doesn't facilitate it. It prevents evolution of complexity. If anything, it makes things evolve backward. So
right. That's what I was thinking too. It just filters out things. That's basically what it does.
And we have good experimental and observational evidence that natural selection
filters out good things.
Yeah,
not bad things.
And a really good example is anything that provides capacity for redundance. Like the space shuttle has 5 navigation systems, all equally capable of bringing the space shuttle back home. So you can understand why they would have 5. So you could knock out 4 and it'll still fly. But in a sense, it'll fly better, assuming you don't have accidents, if it doesn't have that extra weight. And so there's a lot of stuff in biology where if there's a food shortage or a nutrition shortage, the first things to go would be the backup systems, because selection would not generally favor that. That would be a liability because it would have to select for something in the future, and it doesn't. You know, it selects for what works in the present. And so that's the difference. You know, God created natural selection, and it helps. And I think that's one reason there may have been created alleles. It'll help populations survive, not just human created alleles, but it'll help all various sorts of populations survive. But it is a loss of functional functional information. And I try to avoid the word information. I'm a hardware guy. I'm not a software guy, but qualitatively that's the difference. And I'll give you an example from structural biology. The ATP synthase protein complex, it has to be able to allow a hydrogen atom, something the size of a hydrogen atom, to go through it. And it has to fit just right. We have a very hard time engineering anything with that level of precision where it has to be exactly one atom in size in a particular atom. We could say the same of various transmembrane proteins. So if there's a slight variation, just imagine if you're trying to have a nut and a bolt, and the bolt is a little thicker than it should be, or maybe not thick enough. It just doesn't fit right. And so the reason this is hard for natural selection, how do you change something without breaking something at the same time? Because how are you going to change the ATP synthase to be something else without breaking it in the process? And there are all sorts of arguments. We could look at specific systems where this is really bad. And that's one of the problems with evolving eukaryotes from something like a prokaryote-like creature. How do you not kill the creature when you're trying to change it? So that's an example where natural selection would actually prevent change. And it's really funny. The evolutionary biologists don't realize this. Every time they say, well, this is really deeply conserved in prokaryotes, I said, well, that's evidence it's not going to evolve into a eukaryote. Did you ever think of it that way? So,
well, especially, no, I was just going to say, because you make a good point there. Did evolutionists predict these many conserved regions in all of biological life, including even like your Hox genes, for example? Because and if you can go over this a little bit, but according to the evolutionists, we've been evolving for millions and millions of years. So shouldn't our genetics be more of a scrambled mess? But since so many of the genes are conserved, which implies function, because obviously natural selection is what is preserving those regions of our genome, that seems a lot more consistent with, as you pointed out, common design.
I don't have a strong opinion on what you asked. I'm sorry I can't give you a good answer right now. But this leads to a very interesting problem that I've seen. It leads to a contradiction in their own ideas, because I began to say, okay, let's say you can, just according to whatever criteria that they have, define a species, like say a species of tree or whatever, or a species of shark. And then you look at their, you sample, like say within species, you sample all of the proteins, like say one protein family, one class of proteins. Why is it that there's no diversity, insufficient diversity? I said, shouldn't it have been scrambled by now if you're invoking kind of a quasi-neutral model? So I'll ask them, I said, okay, now put this through and estimate how far the most recent common ancestor of this creature is. So this is, again, similar to the mitochondrial clocking and the Y-chromosome clocking, but you could do it for other proteins. It may not get as clear a clock, but I said, doesn't it look kind of bad that all these creatures look like they had a most recent common ancestor kind of like recently, not 300 million years ago? So we have like these living fossil sharks. I said, I've been looking at some of their gene sequences. I said, so, they're supposed to be here like since like 300 million years ago. So why are their genes so similar? They should have been scrambled, just like you said, by now, and they're not.
Right. And they're not. So are you pointing out that a lot of these highly conserved, like let's say mitochondrial proteins, for example, like the CO1 gene they use for DNA barcoding, because there's such limited diversity across all these forms of life? Yeah, like you said, that suggests that they all originated not that long ago, and it's kind of like a double whammy also at the same time.
Yeah. So I'm trying to figure out what the role of conservation is. I'll tell you a very interesting pattern, and this is again why I say that I think creatures have they're kind of like instead of a evolutionary progression, it's more of a conceptual progression from the simple to complex.
Right.
We have, because the enzyme that I'm studying is topoisomerase, and I'm working with a very fine professor of he's an adjunct professor at Vanderbilt Medical School and an associate professor in Lipscomb University in biochemistry, and he was featured in his Genesis history, the extra Joe DeWeese. So you'll see him in his Genesis history lectures. He gives like 3 or 4 lectures.
Okay. Yeah, those are awesome. I love those.
Yes. So we can take human topoisomerases and put them in yeast. We have a variety of topoisomerase 2 enzymes. We can put them in yeast. The yeast will live fine, but we can't do the reverse. We have experimental evidence to that. Just sadly, because we have, some people that have heritable diseases, and it's really evident. We wouldn't even dare try to do that. Not to mention be unethical, but we have experimental evidence. So this is really interesting that we may have conservation in the topoisomerase 2, but the differences in humans are really essential for them. Whereas you could throw all those things that are in a human, put it in a yeast, it wouldn't know what to do with it. It just ignores it, and it can live without it. And so I didn't really answer your question, and I'm sorry about that. But I think the conservation does indicate like kind of a basic architectural information. The conserved regions are very good to help us do first level of structural biology. Some of our first structural biology was done because of the conserved regions. That would help us identify the catalytic residues, like the really important parts of the protein that help it do its thing. So that was like, so what's conserved across species is kind of like it's almost like a street sign. It's like God put these things in there to say, hey, look at this. This is how you're going to figure out. And I posed this to a structural biologist. I said, what would happen if we didn't have those differences? Because the only way conservation is because of diversity. So I can show you multiple sequence alignments, and you'll see that like a position like 100, just for the sake of illustration, is all identical across species, but then it's different in other regions. You wouldn't be able to see those conserved regions if you didn't have regions that were different. And it turns out the conserved regions often identify critically important structural markers. It's like God put a signal there to say, you better look at this. This is really important. And this was pretty important with the ENCODE project, because across all mammals, our histone proteins are identical, 100% identical, almost 100%. And that was always a problem. They said, well, why is it like that? That's suggesting it's all pretty important, and it turned out to be. And that leads to also indirectly why I believe most of the DNA is functional. It's there for.
Right. Me too. What about when it comes to, actually, before I ask you this question, so that enzyme you're talking about, that human
topoisomerase 2, yeah,
right. I'm not even going to begin to try and say that. That's good. So that human species specific enzyme that you're studying, you're saying you'll insert that into yeast, and they won't know what to do with it. Like it'll just sit there. It doesn't do anything. So that's indicating that it's like species specific then.
It's yes, and it does one other thing. It's as if it's like if you gave a primitive man a computer chip, he'd think it's a nice trinket. He wouldn't know what to do.
Right.
Just use it as that's kind of what.
This is cool, but what do I do with it?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Yeah,
so actually that's kind of how the yeast will treat it. It's like it'll use it for something, but then all of its advanced features it's not able to use. But if you took a yeast topoisomerase and tried to put it in a a human. We have experimental evidence to this.
Yes. Okay, that was going to be my next question. Okay.
Yeah, we've actually never done it, although I wouldn't be surprised if someone had tried it to put it in, say, a rat or something. It's like I said, that's God made rats so we could do cruel experiments on them.
All of life has some kind of purpose.
I thought I'd never feel sorry for a rat, but then when I saw what we were doing to them, I started to actually feel sorry
for them. I better not see firsthand what they're doing.
Oh my goodness! So maybe I'll put this in a slide presentation for you all, so you could actually see.
I would love that.
Because
yeah. So would you predict that enzyme, if you take it from a yeast and put it into a rat or put it into a human, would you predict that it would be the same outcome as when you took it from the human and put it into the yeast? That the specific? Oh no.
No, it would be deadly. And
it would be deadly.
Yeah, and so why is it one way? Why does it work going from a complex to a simple, but not from a simple to a complex?
Yes.
That means that, again, it's kind of like a conceptual ladder. When I say evolution in the sense of concept, but not evolution in the sense of common ancestry, it's like God is building up complexity. We can actually see this whole, we're seeing at the level of individual proteins. It's like he designed simple creatures with one form of the protein to help us study it. But then the complex features will be found in the more complex creatures.
Makes sense.
So I'll give you, just like when I gave my talk on the chromatin modifications, I was talking about histone modifications. You could see all the things that look like a computer card that kind of got flipped on and off. Higher eukaryotes, like humans, have their proteins, even if they're the same across species, they have more decorations on them. They look more like a Christmas tree with all the modifications. So the protein actually acts like a random access memory in addition to fulfilling its other functions. It's just, when you said Nathaniel Jeanson, what did he call it with the multiple functions of proteins? What was the term?
Protein moonlighting.
Yes.
Protein multifunctionality. Yeah, because he's got in print. Actually, that's why I liked you talked about the cytochrome C protein, because you'll get from evolutionists all the time a lot of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Herman Mays, but he's he certainly knows his stuff, but he'll look at, for example, the mitochondria, and specifically from the mitochondrial DNA, the proteins it encodes, right? The ATP synthase. And he'll ask, okay, from a design perspective then, creationists, why would, say, the horse ATP synthase proteins have a different mitochondrial DNA sequence than, say, a human or a bird or something like that? Because he'll say, or your evolutionist will say, from a design perspective, they should be identical, but yet we know that there's differences that are separating life, and the evolutionists will say that those differences are a marker of time and divergence, for example. But yeah, like you've said, with these protein, well, I guess is polyfunctionality all throughout the genome. So he's saying that, is this really the only function of the ATP synthase? Because he'll point to the protein multifunctionality, the protein moonlighting. So the evolutionists, they're assuming that the differences are not there for functional purposes. But as you're showing here too, Sal, is that these differences are indeed there for functional purposes, metabolic optimization, for example. I think that's an awesome topic, to be honest with you.
I don't know if, I hate to impose on ways that I am, but I do have some, I could show you one slide as to why.
Yeah, you would never impose on me. I would impose on you because you're awesome to be in here with us.
Actually, that's a good point. Yeah, we would be imposing on you.
I'll show you the work Joe and I did on topoisomerase, and you'll see the difference.
Topoisomerase. Is that how you say it? I see you put it in the side chat. Topoisomerase.
What it means is it changes the topology of DNA, and let me see if I can. Let's see. So this is great because this is a Young Earth Creationist. He's the lead author, and he keeps getting published in scientific journals. And it's like, Oh Lord, please help him not to ever get, censured. But I guess when he's doing such good work, they can't censure him because he's doing critical work in cancer research. So it's really kind of fun because this is how sometimes we study intelligent design and we can publish on it without really publishing on it, if you know what I mean. So I'm going to share my screen, and I hope I don't mess you guys up too bad by doing this. Yeah, that's it. So you could, I don't know if you could see row 7. Do I need to, let me expand my screen a little bit so you could see this picture. I'm going to show you the difference. So first off, Mr. Mays, or Dr. Mays, who was talking about why would God make things different. The simple answer is structural biology and optimization for scientific discovery. But can you see row 7 here? It says yeast top 2. I don't know if you can. Yeah. So it's not quite. I could see that. Oh, it's scrolling down. Okay. All right. So these are different sequences between creatures, with the very top row being human, the second the chimp, number 3 the mouse, number 4 is the chick, number 5 is the frog, number 6 the fruit fly, and number 7 row is the yeast. Now, the letters there are the amino acids of the topoisomerase, and this is the part of the protein that's very different between the creatures. And it turns out we can modify these amino acids chemically. We can add a little chemical like a phosphate group or some other chemical modifications. And so this ends up being like a random access memory where you're flipping the bits. So the human topoisomerase has a different language to it than it would the yeast. And the yeast doesn't, like I said, it'd be like it'd be like giving a computer chip to a primitive man. He wouldn't know what to do with it, because all of these little decorations that I marked here with the arrows are specific to humans, and they're very important to how the human topoisomerase does its moonlighting. So I can elaborate on that more than God willing, if I'm able to come back and put a good slideshow for you all.
Well, already, I want you to go on and on. So you're saying that the human topoisomerase, I hope I said that okay.
Isomerase.
Isomerase. Okay, so the human topoisomerase enzyme. I like the way you put this. It has a different language than that of the yeast.
Yes.
Enzyme. So the moonlighting is different across the species.
Right, and that's also, it's very interesting because that's why the yeast doesn't have any use for it, because it's a simple organism.
Right.
But all that extra space, it's used differently in a human. It'll be deadly. You can't use the yeast topoisomerase. It'll kill a human. Because one thing is the yeast is only a single-celled organism. Humans are multicellular, and it needs that extra stuff because topoisomerase affects the chromatin looping. Topoisomerase beta, 2 beta, I believe. So if some of the listeners that saw my presentation on the 4D nucleome, the topoisomerase, that enzyme it moonlights to do stuff to help it fold. We don't exactly know how, but I think maybe my next presentation will be about protein structure and function.
I would love that.
Because topoisomerase is really cool. What it does is it untangles the DNA, and it does it by cutting it and then restitching it back together.
Wow.
I pointed out.
Okay,
so Praise That I Am asked, what's the difference between natural selection in the creationist view and natural selection in the evolutionary view? In the evolutionary view, natural selection facilitates evolution. In the creationist view, it may help adaptation to just a little bit, but in general, it actually prevents major evolutionary change. So this topoisomerase enzyme is a good example. So just imagine you had an enzyme, and the first topoisomerase, what it did is it just cut the DNA but didn't stitch it back together. It turned your DNA into shreds.
That's not going to help anybody.
Right. So, we talk about, I know we talked about the flagellum and all these other irreducibly complex systems. Topoisomerase is really kind of funny because like that is, what if you had a cutter and didn't stitch it back together?
You had a cutter, but no stitcher. So you're saying even that enzyme, topoisomerase, I'm going to say that 10 times fast, that is irreducibly complex as well.
Yes, exactly. And I don't use the word irreducible. I like interconnecting
Yes.
complexity. The reason is that sometimes God builds machines kind of way more complex and extravagant. You could actually reduce the number of parts, but God adds those extra parts just to be really cool. And that problem made Darwin sick, by the way, because he said, why does a peacock's tail have to be so elaborate as part of the mating ritual? He said it made him sick when he looked at it.
I could imagine it probably kept him up at night. Well, I've adopted your terminology when it comes to, I guess, beneficials, functionally compromised, right?
Yeah, well, that was one of the articles Dr. Sanford and I we ended up getting rejected by the editors. We were criticizing evolutionary theory. I think we went too far. We made too good of a case.
Yeah, don't criticize the holy grail evolution too much. Nobody questions the primary axiom. Actually, I wanted to ask you too, because Dr. Vanima. I think you talked about him before.
Who was this?
Dr. Vanima. He wrote the book.
Oh yeah,
Atom in the Genome.
Oh yeah.
So he spends a lot of time on synteny, which is that large scale organizational. I think in chromosomes, the similarities in the organization of chromosomes, and he shows how similar that is across all forms of life, specifically human and chimps. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, and I don't know how well. I didn't read his book. You've read it. You probably, if you've read it, you're more familiar with it. And again, that's a little bit outside of my specialty. But if he's claiming that, it's like, what planet is he living on? Have you seen the synteny differences between a mouse and a human? And I've actually posed the question: how can you change synteny between without killing the organism in the process?
Right. Good point.
So
he'll say, Sal, he'll say there's no biological reason why this needs to be the case. But yet, once again, new data in molecular biology is showing that this large-scale organization of the genome that he points to, that I guess we call synteny, is also highly important in our genetics, in actually arranging these structures and whatnot. So once again, they're wrong. I mean, they're always assuming junk, and then years later, we're discovering function. Like it's like egg on the face again.
Oh, it's so bad, and they only get away with it because they're evolutionists, and that's kind of the reigning paradigm. Because the alternative is usually unacceptable to a lot of the scientific class, which is kind of sad. But I will say this: that's slowly changing. Because I was at a biochemistry class at the NIH, and the professor's saying, "Wow, look at this!" He's describing a system, a biochemical system. He said, "That's just so well designed," and he said, "Oops, I'm not supposed to say that." The whole class laughed. They just laughed when he said this, so well designed, because everyone kind of knew that. It is well designed. We're just not supposed to say that, but everyone could see it. And a lot of my classmates, they're friendly to design. Some of them said they don't believe in evolution. So things are changing. As someone said, science marches forward one funeral at a time. So maybe as the old guard's kind of retiring, there'll be a change in sentiment at the top. I'm praying for it anyway.
We got a super chat from. Did you see that SFT? Did you already address that, or when he's back? I guess I'll read it. Maybe he'll respond to it. It's from George Bond. He says, "I miss most of this, but I look forward to watch it from the start." So, thanks for the super chat, George Bond. That was really kind of you to do that.
Yeah, thanks, George. Sorry, I was distracted at the time.
Yeah, thanks, George.
All contributing to this channel. It's a wonderful. This is the best scientific channel I know of right now. That speaks the truth, and it's an awesome thing. I just appreciate everyone contributing.
Yeah, it is nice when people help, I suppose. It's if it wasn't for people helping, then yeah. Anyway, thank you. That's very nice of you, George. That's great. Now, what were you saying, Salvador or Sal?
Well, actually, I wanted to ask you a question, Jason.
Yes.
You said you were an atheist once. I hope you'll share a little bit of your conversion.
Oh, I was just I just slowly got introduced to creation science. At first, I just completely dismissed it, and then, I had all these. My dog's just drinking in the background there, by the way. So if you hear that, so I'm drinking out of the water bowl. Yeah. So I basically just little bits and pieces of creation science, and at first I didn't pay much attention, and then when I eventually over a few years I started to look into it more and more, and see stuff that I couldn't refute. Well, that's when I started to really believe again. Sorry, it's my dog. Let him, mate. Good boy. That's a good boy. Yeah, no, that's when I started to really believe again. Like when I started to see the this sort of stuff, and Ken Hovind and stuff like that, and then I wanted to get into it more and more and learn more and more. So that's basically ended up here, yeah, and learning about genetics and proteins and stuff like that. But yeah, it's like I was a creationist, and when I was a kid, and then I lost my faith when I was 10, and then it was gone for up until about like probably 5 years ago, and it's so a long time, for decades. So yeah, and I lost my faith. I lost my faith because of I heard about the vestigial tailbone, and like when you're 10 years old, you imagine having a tail where you can swing around with your tail and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Well, praise God. Praise God for your return back. The prodigal son comes back. I've been there, so
love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had so the last time I talked to you, I said I wanted to hear how that happened. That's
yeah. Well, yeah. There's a lot of stuff that happened in between then, but yeah, that's basically what happened. It was a long time, and just times I used to laugh at Christians and persecute Christians, and think it was funny to constantly run them down, attack them, and mock them, and yeah. So I know how evolutionists think. And I was talking with some guy the other day. He was talking about it. I was just laughing. He's like, "I am so morally superior to you," like, because we believe in God, giving the commandments to kill and stuff in the Bible, and then we have faith in God, so we believe in God's word. God was doing the right thing, and so he's sort of saying that sort of, and it made me laugh, because I thought, well, where do your morals come from, mate? They don't come from. They don't come from atheism or evolution, like from a big bang. Yeah, it was just funny that he was telling us about how morally superior he was to us, and then in the end he said that the best way to handle it, he said, is get all the priests and all of them, all the pastors and priests and everything, and line them up and just shoot them all. And we went, okay, so you agree with what God did by trying to wipe out all the pagans in the beginning? That was pretty funny, the way Neff, turned it around on him. Yeah, anyway.
Well, praise God. Well,
yeah.
That made my evening. Thanks.
No problem.
So we got another super chat from Meek Alien LTE. That person says, "Thanks for the great job you all do to defend creation." Yeah, we appreciate your generous donation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Well,
thank you.
I'll tell you what. I'm going to commit to trying to get a slideshow for you all for protein structure. And one thing that I have a passion about is that it's actually not that hard to learn some of this, but usually protein structure is given after someone's had like 2 semesters of general chemistry, 2 semesters of organic, and 2 semesters of biochemistry. That's because the traditional way that the academia is set up is to train organic chemists or medical doctors or other kinds of people in those disciplines. They're not using the science to actually help people wonder at their creator. But if that were what we were trying to teach, it's actually not that hard to teach some of the wonders of protein structure. So I'm going to try to put that together, see if I can be able to teach it within an hour's time.
Wow, that'd be awesome. I can't wait.
And you'll actually begin to see some of the better, we've improved the probability arguments. So some people have been citing Doug Axe for his work on the beta lactamases. But one thing I realized, and I've talked to other biochemists and structural biologists, is that each protein has a different probability associated with it. And so there's some tricks that aren't so wholesome that evolutionists use to say that the probabilities aren't that remote. And so I'll also show some of the counters, but you'll really see why protein functions if you see the structure. And that's been the difference, say, in like the last 5-10 years, is we're actually having very good 3-dimensional models. Because when you can actually see the shape of things and how important it is to be shaped a certain way, it demystifies everything.
That reminds me, this guy, he said, "Have you actually seen an actual photo of DNA?" And he said, like an electron microscope type photo. And I said, "Yes, I have." And I said, "So what?" I said, "Don't judge a book by its cover. Have you ever heard that?" I said, "It's not what it looks like. It's what's the information that's contained within." And that was one of his arguments, that when you actually see it, like the way it actually looks, it's very unimpressive, and because it looks unimpressive, then it must be it's not that hard for it to form just naturally. Sort of, that was his argument, which is pretty funny and hilarious. But anyway, I thought you might find that funny.
Oh, well, maybe not as funny as DNA is like Diet Coke. I'm sorry.
Simple.
Hey, godless engineer, if you're hearing me say this, no hate intended for me to you, but if you say stuff like that, people are going to make fun of you. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Indeed, yeah. He brings a lot of himself.
Yeah. Oh well, it'll teach him. To be careful about what he says more.
Well, that's interesting that they said it's not that. He said it's not that compelling. Well, maybe in a bacteria, it may not be that compelling, but it has both physical, because not only do proteins fold, RNA folds, but DNA also folds, and that's what the subject of the 4D nucleome project is. Those sequences that are supposedly junk DNA contribute to the ability for it to form certain structures, and it's exquisitely put together to be able to fold a certain way so that it doesn't get. If you've ever seen, like, maybe I'll show some graphs of it. How does it not totally tangle with each other? How can it all sort itself out? It's just amazing, and create something as complex as a human being. So it's exquisitely. But one thing it doesn't have, which is actually a good feature, it actually doesn't have a lot of catalytic ability like a protein. And the Origin of Life researchers have said that's actually a good feature, because you don't want your genetic, the code, the material that provides the genetic code, you don't want it to be an enzyme at the same time, because that could be kind of bad. I don't know exactly the reasons, but one thing that enzymes are really good at is cutting other things to pieces. So it's probably good that it's kind of somewhat bland in that respect.
So, do you agree with Bill Gates? Because he says DNA is the most advanced program that's ever been created. Do you think that's just a layman talking about it that's ignorant, or do you think that's actually probably the case?
I slightly disagree because I actually think the most complicated program is in the glycome. So we've talked a lot about the genome is like one of the easiest things to analyze and copy in the human cell, but there's stuff in what they call the cytoplasm, which is kind of like most of the rest of the cell, that is so difficult to duplicate. We cannot build a cytoplasm from scratch. We can build DNA from scratch with difficulty, but the cytoplasm has sugars in it, glycans, and that's why we call it like the glycome. If you take the collection of all the sugars in a cell, we could kind of call that the glycome. And I actually think that's where all the sophisticated information is. They've done some calculations on the capacity, the information bearing capacity of glycans. It's like three orders of magnitude more than DNA or proteins, because it stores information in 3 dimensions. Not only that, they're more sugars inside the DNA. I mean, inside the cell, there are more sugars like that, glycans, than there are DNA nucleotides. So that's where I would disagree. And the other thing is, when we say DNA is, what did Bill Gates say? He said it's the most
far more advanced than any computer software that's ever been created.
The slight distinction I give is DNA is hardware, but the software resides on it. So we can say the shorthand DNA is software, but it's not. I prefer to say it's hardware that contains the software. There's a slight distinction. That's splitting hairs, but I split hairs like that because when I debate evolutionists, the reason I avoid information theory is information is a little bit in the eye of the beholder, how to define it. We can, like, for example, I could get into debates as to how many bytes there are in a given MP4 file. Do you judge it by the number of actual physical bytes or how much it decompresses to? So that's one reason I avoid. That's the reason I split the hairs and say between hardware and software. The hardware itself, you can make really strong probability arguments. But so to answer your question, DNA is sophisticated, but I don't think I think some of our programming languages, some of the software we've written might actually be more sophisticated, man-made ones. But the one that is really sophisticated is in the glycome. Because when I was showing like the 4D nucleome stuff, I asked a researcher, he was actually my professor, I said, well, how do you get all these modifications on the chromatin? He said, no one knows. No one knows.
That's incredible. I appreciate you answering that.
So I talked to some ID proponents, and Jonathan Wells wrote me once. He said, look at the glycome. That's where we think it is. And you'll see it in Stephen Meyer's book, either Signature in the Cell or Darwin's Doubt. He said that's probably where a lot of the information for being able to build like the organs of human beings, because pretty much approximately all the DNA is the same across cell types. So where's all that information stored that helps it to differentiate, like say a bone cell from a nerve cell? And they think it's both in the membranes and in the sugar code. And the sugar code's the next frontier. We're spending maybe $22 billion a year collectively around the world because pharmaceutical companies need to know this. And that's one thing I wanted to say. God's brought a lot of allies unwittingly to the creationist movement, and they don't know it. The pharmaceutical industry. Yeah, I'm sorry, Jason. Go ahead.
That's the carbohydrates, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's like the sugars of the carbohydrates they're trying to work out, and that's like far more complex than even DNA sort of thing. Really, I mean, the amount of them that there is.
that's one of the next frontiers. And the reason
Yeah.
pharmaceutical companies are interested is
Yeah.
what they have to do is they want to be able to deliver drugs into the cells, and they can't get through the membrane barrier unless they have the way of unlocking it so it'll open up, so their pharmaceutical substance can get through. And to do that, they have to reprogram the sugar code, and that's why they're interested. So they have to figure it out. And so God's given us some powerful allies, because the biotech, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical science research industry is giving us all this ammunition, and they're just demolishing the evolutionary biologists. That's why they're having a meltdown over ENCODE.
They want to get rid of at least one of their enemies. Enemies of their God. Their God, atheism and evolution. They're bowing down to it. Have a picture of a fish eating an atheist. That should be the symbol of evolution.
Yeah. So I know some of I could be wrong when I said DNA may not be that sophisticated. God has a way of surprising us. Maybe it's not, I wouldn't say software, but as a hardware device, it is beyond anything we have as a hardware device.
Yeah.
So what I mean by hardware is like a storage device. We're finding DNA stores information not just along its sequence, but also its three-dimensional conformation. I saw a paper recently that said DNA is like a 3D storage device. We can't understand its polymer characteristics. So maybe not software, but I'd say it's better hardware than we've ever understood. And that's probably just scratching the surface, because the glycone's probably even more.
That's fascinating, man. That's incredible. Thank you for taking your time to answer that.
Yeah, the carbohydrates is because they've discovered 40,000 different, or probably more since now, but 40,000 different lipids. I mean, that's just the lipids, and then you got the carbohydrates. There's way more, and that's only the ones they've discovered too.
Yeah. So if any of you there are listening, just Google the sugar code. If you Google sugar code, you'll see it. In fact, I'll do it right now. Sugar code. Yeah, you'll see. You'll get all sorts of hits on the sugar code. So one reason we haven't studied it more, it's too difficult.
Yeah.
We don't, we can do DNA sequencing. We can't do sugar code sequencing very well, because just like in this, I just saw this headline. Can chemists crack our cells' sugar code? And then from Cell Press, which is a scientific journal, it said the magic of the sugar code. So you're going to see that's like the next frontier. And so people were thinking, oh, we mapped the human genome, we've got it figured out. It's like, nah, you've only scratched the surface. You have no clue.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's for certain.
I'll tell you.
Sorry.
Oh, go on, Jason.
No, it's okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was saying, if we took all of our best scientists on the planet and best engineers, made the sum total of them, just ask them to try to build a cell from scratch, they can't do it. It's that complex.
Incredible.
I've even joked, I said, let's even give them the blueprints for every part. They wouldn't have the manufacturing capability.
Well, when you said before that he said he's one of the scientists, you said that he said he created life, but he didn't. I sort of know, I sort of have an idea what he did. Do you have just like a cursory understanding of what he actually did to what he reckons created life but didn't? And I mean, I know that he didn't. He just took parts of other cells and then put them inside of a cell skin wall or something, didn't he?
Well, what he did, he had the sequence he had the gene sequence of one bacteria, and he put it in a computer. So he used that as a model. He couldn't even build DNA from scratch. He couldn't even program the DNA from scratch. So yeah, I just said DNA may not be that sophisticated to software, but even then, he couldn't do it from scratch. He couldn't build a gene from scratch. So he had to borrow blueprints, and then he put that in a computer, and then he had to hire a very sophisticated company to synthesize the DNA from his computer, what he stored in his computer. That was a very difficult process. And then he stuck it in a different bacteria, and after like several years of work, it failed. It failed, and they couldn't figure out why. It took them a year to figure out. And it was just one base pair that was wrong, that didn't get copied correctly from the original, from that other bacteria. Just one base pair out of maybe 500,000 lines of, or maybe 1 million bases.
That's crazy.
Just
That's
one
funny.
out of it. Just shut the whole thing down. I think it was a critical enzyme for DNA either repair or replication. Just shut
no.
Yeah, you can see what happens if you get one thing wrong in the wrong
All
spot.
that work.
So it took him a year to figure it out, and then he managed to get it inserted in the bacteria, and he claimed he made a cell from scratch, and that was total hype. I don't want to call him a liar, but that is
outright lie. I mean, I've had them use that on me. Like, so I'll look at this. They've created life, and I said, look, before I even read this, I know what they've done. They would have had to have taken something that was already living, and then put it into something else that was already living, and just changed it around. They haven't created anything because I know they couldn't write it from scratch. And they're going, no, you don't know what you're talking about. You're unscientific, typical creationist and all that sort of stuff. It's really funny to watch, but that's funny that you say anyway.
Well, a lot of the raw ingredients they never got from just like straight basic actually 99% of life is made of just 6 elements: hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, sulfur, and phosphorus. So you could build a lot of life just with that. They never start out with just that. They harvest stuff from living organisms first. Try to put it together. So they had a whole cell that was made from other cells, and then the DNA. They tried to build the DNA. They could only build it in like 65 bases at a time, because DNA, at least in the way they do it in eukaryotes, it can duplicate DNA, just phenomenal speed and like 1 million bases, and they'll do it accurately. Our best laboratory techniques could only do 65 at a time, because after that it gets a little longer. It starts to not work so well, our process. We can't do it anywhere near as fast.
Wow.
So, and it was mistaken because it only took one base pair to be wrong in the copy process, and it shut down years of work. So the experiment actually showed us how hard it is to make life. And what I try to point out, I said, even if we give human beings the blueprint, hypothetically, to build life, we would not have the instruments to do it. And so why do we think it's going to emerge from a primordial soup or whatever? It just boggles the imagination.
So I might have a question that's off topic, but you don't have to answer this, Sal. But according to your best knowledge, or how you would discern the scientific community, are most biologists and scientists swayed to evolution, and is this a small minority, or is the tide turning more to intelligent design? It's just you don't have to answer that.
That's a good question.
I'll give you my best guess as far as guesses go. There was an interesting poll that was done whether the trends in they poll the number of atheists, the number of scientists that are atheists, and the ones that are believing in some sort of deity. And the older ones tended to be more atheistic. The younger ones tended to be more friendly to God.
Wow.
Now, there's Yeah. Now there's some problem with it. It's like, well, an evolutionist told me, he said, well, that means that as they grow older, they reject God. And I said, I'm not so sure of that. We would need a sociologist to kind of, some social scientist to try to undo all that. But I'll tell you that just the fact, just this is anecdotal, but look at the fact that John Sanford got to speak at the NIH. All right, he's a young Earth creationist. He got to speak there. You know who didn't get to speak in that? It was the Mazur Auditorium, which they reserved for like dignitaries. They rolled out the red carpet, and contrary to what you'll hear on the internet, they said we rented a room. That's a total lie. I've corrected people on it because I was involved in setting up the meeting. It was it was NIH staff that helped get us. It's the government that actually paid for him to be there. So they didn't invite Dan Grauer, who said all these nasty things about the NIH, to speak in the. They invited John Sanford. So, and then the other thing is, Bill Basner and John Sanford wrote the what was it on Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection with mutations, and that was in the Journal of Mathematical Biology in 2018, and. The funny thing is, John said, you know what? That set the record for the number of downloads for an open access paper in the journal's history. So what happened was Bill Basner got invited to the International Society of Conservation Biology. He was the keynote speaker. So we're seeing all this. And I hear, just like I said, when I was in the NIH, you just kind of get the feeling that people just find it hard to believe that this is an accident or that natural selection can explain it.
Yeah.
Especially the medical researchers. So the tide is turning. The other thing is, I heard that the idea of a traditional biologist is kind of going by the wayside because the people that are involved in biological research are physicists, engineers, computer scientists, chemists, not evolutionary biologists. They're like the least relevant.
That's incredible.
So, I mean, they take exception to me saying that, but I said, you just look at any top research team that is doing stuff. You look at their qualifications. I rarely see evolutionary biologists there. I will see more people that have computer backgrounds that are computer scientists that do bioinformatics, or more physicists and more engineers than I do evolutionary biologists. That's gotta hurt. So
yeah, awkward there.
Gotta hurt. So the other thing, and this is kind of sad, Christians going through university, they're probably not going to go into the humanities, the social sciences. They're not going to go into gender studies program. So where else are they going to go? Engineering and the hard sciences, the STEM fields, which end up being where biology is the breakthroughs now. I mean, if you have a conference of biologists trying to solve medical problems, you're not going to have many evolutionary biologists there unless they're doing epidemiology type studies. But that's about it. They're not breaking stuff. They're not doing a lot of stuff in some of the other critical fields. I mean, that's kind of harsh, but well, that's the truth. And sometimes we need to be harsh on them because they think too much of themselves and their discipline.
So that's actually good news. Maybe people are being more objective on science now, not so, hard they're swayed to this evolutionary paradigm. That's awesome to hear. Yeah.
So I hope it'll change, but when we look at culture, it's kind of hard to say where our hearts will be because it can be demoralizing sometimes when we see the people leaving the faith. But the one area that I've seen where there's been maybe the one demographic that is holding to their faith, and maybe even growing, are the scientists and engineers. And so I don't know what, I'd like to think that the world is getting better, but the Lord has something to say about that. Right. If we're near the end of the world. So
Yep. Wonder where SFT went. He took a good stint there.
Well, so maybe I'll try to get a slideshow ready, and I really thank you for hosting this. We have, I see 18, 19 people still watching, but maybe we can reconvene sometime. I'd be very honored to serve you all, because I'm, it's wonderful to be received and loved, because I've been getting a lot of hate from these journal editors.
Oh man, that's horrible.
Yeah, Sal, we would love to have you. Really, you're always welcome on. We always learn something. No, I was here listening to everything. I could listen to you talk all day, Sal. Very, you always got, like I said, we learn something every time. So,
well, maybe I'll shoot for maybe a week and a half to try to have something ready for you all.
Yeah.
And I also have an ulterior motive for doing this. I'm hoping I can get more people to recognize my work, because Dr. Sanford commissioned me to write a book, or maybe several books, and I'm hoping this is one way that I can help market it. So some of the stuff, the slideshows I present will be prospective chapters right out of our book. And
that's awesome.
It'd be an opportunity for me to get feedback if you feel I'm connecting. So,
of course. Actually, Sal, if there's anything we can do for you, if you ever want us to put any links into like the description box of these videos, like anything we can do to help you get your work out there, get your a little bit more recognition. I mean, anything. We appreciate all the help and service you've done for us. So.
Well, thank you. Hopefully we can work together as brothers in Christ, as part of God's Christ's body, and move forward the creation argument. I was really moved by what Jason said today, that as he began to be exposed to creation, that may have contributed to his return to Christianity. So that means a lot to me. It means that the work we're doing is important.
Amen, brother. It's all about, at the end of the day, reaching the lost. And the thing is, you're right. Like evolution and these forms of science, falsely so-called, they oftentimes hinder people from even wanting to hear the gospel or hearing about Jesus Christ. Like I know that's how it was with me. Evolution and deep time kind of hindered me from really, I guess, being open to the gospel. But once those blinders were removed, and then I heard the gospel and got saved. So I do believe that the creation message is extremely important. So, I mean, I love all the work you've been doing, Sal. You're a blessing, brother.
Well, you guys too. So I guess it's getting late, and I have to start going back to restudying my organic chemistry. So this is really great. He's tutoring me in organic chemistry. He keeps writing me back. He said, "Hey Sal, when's our next session?" And it's like, wow, he's really generous. He must really like me. I like him too. And I'm sorry he gets offended by some of the stuff I say, because I love the guy to death.
Well, sometimes I think he's our number one fan, and yeah, we like him too. We've had some good discussions and debates, and he's funny. So, and you're a likable guy, Sal. So I don't blame him.
Oh, thanks. All right. Well, I got to sign off, and I look forward to hanging out with you guys some more. It's nice to be welcome in some place, because the last 6 years is I've John and I've been feeling relatively unwelcome.
Wow.
Wow. You tell John he's always welcome here too.
Yeah.
You guys have friends in us, that's for certain. Because
all right.
I know Dr. Sanford's been an incredible blessing on my life. So yeah, I mean, you guys are always welcome. I mean, it's crazy how quickly 3.5 hours can go by, but yeah.
Wow.
To the audience, I hope they enjoyed. I hope they got something out of this. That's the most important part. And Sal, like I said, we always learn something from you. So,
and I'd like to thank all our faithful listeners and contributors to this channel, and just being a part. And it's an honor to be of service to you all. So thanks for all your kind words too. So God willing, this is not goodbye. Until we meet again.
Amen.
And this time tomorrow night, I'll have a mad headache because I'll have had a molar pulled out of my head.
Well, I'll say a prayer for you, Jason.
I'm looking forward to that one. All right, okay. I'll see you later. God bless.
God bless.
God bless.
Later,
God bless.
everyone.
Yeah.